Chapter 38:18. When Yuan closed his eyes. Yimubai, don't you have anything to do? I want to make love. There's nothing else to do today. He smiled and reached out to caress her belly. These 2 days are our last chance. Why don't we work harder? He was joking with her, and when Yuan did not take it seriously. She felt that he had purposely made her pregnant last night, and it was almost all in the traditional position of Z. If she still didn't get pregnant, she would think that there was something wrong with them. She didn't say anything. He could tell that she was under a lot of pressure, so he rubbed her head and said, "You'll get pregnant. I have a hunch." When Yuan looked at him and smiled faintly. It was a little warm and gentle. Yimubai's gaze also fell on her face. After a long time, he gently kissed her. This kiss was a little different from before. When Yuan was a little startled. "Are you silly?" He hugged her and leaned against the headboard. Then, he looked at the French window opposite them and the changed curtains. When Yuan also looked at him. She wasn't sure if he liked this style, and she didn't know if he would be angry that she changed her original style. Yimubai lowered his head. "It's pretty." He reached out and patted her head. "You can change it anywhere you want." As he spoke, he seemed to think of something. He took out a card from the drawer on the side and put it in her hand. "This is my secondary card. If you want to buy anything, you can withdraw it or swipe it. The password is Xiangnan's birthday." When Yuan wanted to reject, but Yimubai's voice rang out faintly. "When Yuan, we're husband and wife now. You don't have to be so distant with me. Is there a problem with a man raising a family?" When Yuan lowered his head and said nothing. Yimubai gently held her in his arms and coughed, "Or do you think it's better for me to sleep with you for free?" She stared at him with wide eyes. "Sleep with me and pay for my services." He rubbed his chin, "Sounds good." When Yuan bit his lip. "Yimubai, can you not do this?" All the joking in his eyes disappeared, and he looked at her seriously. When Yuan's voice was very soft. "You're not like this." "Then what kind of man am I?" He hugged her easily. "Isn't it normal to give your wife money to spend? Also, it's normal for me to have sex with my wife, unless you want me to spread out. In the past, I could control myself because I didn't have a wife. Now, there's no reason for me to be abstinent, right?" When Yuan looked at him, his voice even lighter and more airy. "I always thought that we should keep some distance. When Yuan, you're the one who thinks this way, but I've never thought this way. There isn't a husband in the world who thinks this way. As a husband and wife, we need to keep our distance." "Where did you learn this from? Did you learn it from your marriage with Yi Mulin?" He held her chin and whispered, "You've kissed and hugged him in front of me, do you feel anything?" When Yuan was dumbfounded. Was he going to interrogate her? She stared blankly and shook her head slowly. "No." He chuckled softly. "It's good that you don't. I believe that you don't either." When Yuan was still looking at him. After a long time, he asked softly, "Do you mind?" He grunted, his eyes never leaving her. When Yuan licked his lips and looked away. "At that time, I thought you were gone." She thought about it, a little sad, and laughed at herself. When Yuan. He called her name. "Basically, I'm a very pragmatic man. If I like you, I like you. If I don't like you, I don't like you. I won't lie to you and say that I liked you in the past, but I like you now." She was stunned again. He said, "Like?" She stared straight at him, looking a little silly and stupid. Jiutian Shenhuang. Chapter 38:19. Chapter 38:19, Pregnancy. When Yuan woke up again, it was already afternoon. The sun shone on the soft bed. When she woke up, her entire body was sore and limp. It was an indescribable feeling. She opened her eyes and looked around. It was a little dazzling, so she covered her eyes with her hands. Lying down, her body was limp and she didn't want to move. Then, she buried her face in the pillow again. There was Yimubai's scent in the pillow. It was a very unique scent. When Yuan buried her face, suddenly, she remembered what happened last night and this morning. Her face was a little red, so she kept burying her face. At this moment, the door opened and a little person ran in. She threw herself on the bed and pulled the blanket. "Mummy." The next second, the little fellow was stunned. Because Mummy wasn't wearing any clothes. The little fellow stared at her blankly for a long time. Then, she whispered to Yimubai behind her, "Will Mummy catch a cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yimubai followed behind and immediately covered Wen Yuan with the blanket. Then, he carried the little fellow and placed him on the sofa. He hugged her with the blanket. "Do you remember?" Wen Yuan's face was a little red. "Bring Xiangnan out." Xiangnan was still thinking about the previous question. "Won't Mummy feel cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yimubai looked at his son and said seriously, "Daddy will keep Mummy warm. In the future, you will keep your wife warm too." Xiangnan suddenly felt embarrassed. His little face was red. "Can I keep Baianan warm?" Yimubai and Wen Yuan were stunned. Then, as the father, he was about to go berserk. He shouted at Yi Xiangnan, "That's your sister." Xiangnan shrugged, feeling that it was quite a pity. After all, he thought that Baianan's little body was quite cute. He had secretly taken a look. She had a big head and a small body. She was super cute. Yi Xiangnan looked at his loving parents and felt that he was a little extra, so he ran out quietly. At this time, Yimubai pushed aside the quilt and looked at the little girl in his arms. He said in a low voice, "Are you tired?" Wen Yuan let him hug him and rested his chin on his shoulder. After a long time, he finally said, "It hurts a little." Yimubai was taken aback for a moment before he reached his hand under the blanket. Wen Yuan shrieked, "Yimubai, what are you doing? Does it hurt?" He lowered his eyes to stare at her face. Under his gaze, Wen Yuan's face turned red. Unable to speak for a long time, she could only bury her face in his chest. His fingertips were gentle as he massaged her. She was in his arms, and they had never experienced such intense affection before, just like every other pair of newlyweds. The only difference was that they already had a very big child. At this moment, it was so hot. After a long time, he asked her with a hoarse voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan didn't say anything and just hugged him. He was a mature man who understood women, especially her body. He leaned against her ear and asked in a low voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan bit his lip and didn't say anything for a long time. He chuckled and continued to massage her for a while. He only let go when both of them couldn't take it anymore. After coaxing her for a long time, he finally helped her put on a set of home clothes. When he was about to leave, Wen Yuan pulled his hand. "Yimubai, will we have children?" He turned around and smiled. "We will. Don't worry." In fact, Xiangnan's condition was under control. Even if they couldn't get pregnant this month, they could delay it for another 2 months. There would be no problem at all. Moreover, he had a feeling that she was already pregnant with his child. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:20. Chapter 38:20, Pregnancy this time, he hoped that it would be a girl, like Baianan. Wen Yuan pursed her lips. Yimubai scratched her face. "I'll heat up the food for you. Come out after you brush your teeth and wash your face." She wasn't used to this. Perhaps it was because she had maintained a cold relationship with him for too long. She looked at him in a daze and said softly, "Yimubai." He nodded and looked at her. "Actually, you don't have to be so nice to me. Just be the same as before," she said uncomfortably. He smiled and stretched out his hand to gently touch her soft and tender face. However, he did not say anything and directly walked out. When Yuan's face was a little hot. She didn't say anything and immediately went to brush her teeth and wash her face. However, her heart was still beating very fast. She thought to herself that it had been so long. How could she be so easily seduced by him again, when Yuan went out after brushing her teeth and washing her face? Yimubai had already prepared the food. It was 4 delicious dishes and 1 soup. She saw that he hadn't touched it, so she looked at him. "Xiangnan made it. I haven't eaten yet." He smiled faintly and sat down with her. "Auntie, I asked her to go back." When Yuan nodded. She felt a little uncomfortable sitting with him. "Don't you want to ask me about what happened last night?" Yimubai's voice was indifferent. When Yuan ate very slowly and looked up at him very slowly. Then, she said softly, "I suddenly don't want to know." He smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. "You've become silly, but cute." When Yuan looked at him and forgot to eat. He rubbed her face again. "What are you looking at? Eat more." When Yuan didn't know if it was an illusion, but his attitude towards her had changed. However, it wasn't fixed. He was still not very gentle in bed and would sometimes be very rough. However, he took good care of her in daily life. He still had to go on business trips. He would go out for 2 days every 3 to 5 days. His mode of travel was often a helicopter. He flew between all the continents in America. When Yuan was slowly getting used to it, he would often come home in the middle of the night, and when she was asleep, he would wake her up badly, and then he would make love to her, sometimes too eager to remove his clothes, sometimes even all night long. When Yuan felt that this was like the start of a honeymoon. He no longer mentioned having a child, but she had a premonition that she was pregnant, because her waist had been sore recently, her appetite was good, and she was also lazy. That day, he wasn't around. Her period hadn't come for 2 days, so when Yuan went out to buy a pregnancy test kit and tested it in the bathroom. When the 2 red lines slowly appeared, she felt a little complicated. She was pregnant. She gently covered her lips and didn't say anything for a long time. At this time, she really wanted to tell Yimubai that she was pregnant. When Yuan called her, she felt a little uneasy. What happened when she was pregnant with Xiangnan had traumatized her. But this time, the call was quickly picked up. It was his gentle voice. "What's wrong, Wen Yuan?" "Yimubai, where are you?" She said very softly. "I'm pregnant. Can you come home?" When she said this, she felt a little wronged. Because these days, he had been flying around and spending half of his time outside. He wasn't at home even when she was pregnant. Even when he was at home, he spent most of his time in bed. She had a feeling that he clearly didn't have time, but he deliberately came home to spend the night just to spend the night. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-21. Pregnancy 5. After when Yuan said that, the person on the other side seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then, he said in a very soft voice, "Is it true?" She didn't know if she was acting coquettishly, but Yimubai felt that she was acting coquettishly. His voice became even gentler. "I still have something to do. I'll ask Su Mo to accompany you to the hospital first. Xiangnan asked Auntie to check on him for a long time, and he's fine. I'll go to the hospital after I'm done, okay?" He had thought it through and made arrangements, but when Yuan refused. I'll go to the hospital myself. Good girl, listen to me. I'm not worried about her driving. He coaxed her a little, then looked at the higher-ups in the conference room and gestured for them to continue the meeting. He cleared his throat and spoke to Wen Yuan again. I'll head over after I'm done. I'm in New York now. Wen Yuan hung up. She couldn't describe her feelings. She wasn't someone who would throw a tantrum, and she wasn't someone who needed to be taken care of. But when he took care of her and arranged everything, she felt like something was missing. Was it because he had become arrogant because he was favored? Su Mo arrived very quickly. She was a short girl, but she was quick in her work. She was methodical and did not have any personal feelings. She was like a working machine. In this aspect, she was very similar to one person, Yi Mulin. When Yuan was quite bored sitting in her car, because he couldn't find a topic to talk about with this little girl. Su Mo drove very carefully. What a joke. Her boss's pregnant wife was sitting in the car. How could she not be careful? The car drove to an expensive private hospital. Miraculously, there was a Chinese gynecologist. It was very convenient to communicate with them, but the price was not cheap. When Yuan did a checkup, and the results showed that she was indeed pregnant, half an hour later, she was sitting on a bench in the corridor of the hospital. Su Mo was talking to Yi Mubai on the phone. She spoke to him in English. When Yuan understood what she was saying, but he was complaining in his heart. Fake foreigner, we are all Chinese, why are you speaking in English? After talking for about 5 minutes, Su Mo hung up the phone and came over to sit with Wen Yuan. Tilting his head, he said, Director Yi said he'll be here soon. He asked us to wait here for a while. After that, she squeezed out a smile on her face, Mrs. Yi, congratulations. Wen Yuan also forced a smile and picked at his fingernails, feeling quite amazed. She thought that Su Mo would not smile. Su Mo felt quite uncomfortable. He reached out and scratched his head again. Actually, it was night director who arranged for me to go. I didn't want to go either. I had no choice. I'm getting paid. Then she laughed, and so did Wen Yuan. She had actually been jealous of this indifferent assistant. Thinking about it, she felt that she was very childish. Yi Mubai was even more childish. After the two of them talked for a while, Yi Mubai came over. His footsteps were fast and hurried, but when he saw Wen Yuan, he slowed down and stood 5 meters away from him. Su Mo stood up and said, I'll be taking my leave then. As she passed Yi Mubai, she said in a low voice, Congratulations. Yi Mubai gave her a gentle look. Su Mo thought to herself that he was finally giving her a good look. Director Yi wasn't a man who was easy to get along with. She had read the previous report that said Best Actor Yi was especially gentle. She secretly felt that her boss and he were two different men, or that he had schizophrenia. Now she knew that the reason he was so cold before was because he wasn't happy and didn't have a woman. End of chapter. Chapter 38-22. Pregnancy 6. What Lin Shui, Lin Danny, none of them were what he wanted. Now that he had gotten what he wanted, it was like a man who had been abstinent for a few years had suddenly started eating meat. Su Mo left, leaving only Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai in the long corridor. His gaze was on her, and she sat there looking at him. She said softly, When I called you, I was a little scared. I was afraid that no one would answer, that you would disappear again. His gaze became a little gentle, and then he slowly walked over and hugged her. No. He gently hugged her shoulders and said in a low voice, No, Wen Yuan. She lay on his shoulder and finally hugged his waist. There was a faint smell of tobacco on his body, as well as the smell of disinfectant from the office. It smelled good when mixed together. She kept hugging him. Yi Mubai smiled. What's wrong? Are you unhappy about being pregnant? She shook her head, and then nodded randomly. I'm happy. She was just a little confused and helpless because of happiness. She hadn't thought about happiness when she married him. She thought that it was just to have a child and cure Xiangnan. He had given her so much, but she was afraid. Yi Mubai, I'm afraid. She closed her eyes. I'm afraid that I'm dreaming, and you won't be here when I wake up. Yi Mubai reached out and gently stroked her hair, comforting her. Pregnant people shouldn't be sentimental, huh? She grunted and still hugged him. Actually, he liked it when she hugged him. She was like a child, different from the usual when Yuan. He liked it too, but he was afraid that she would be immersed in such emotions for too long, so he comforted her and brought her downstairs to sit in the black RV. Along the way, he hugged her and comforted her. When they arrived at the apartment, Yi Mubai helped her out of the car and went home together. Xiangnan was very happy to know that he would have a little brother and sister. The originally weak little guy made an exception and rolled on the carpet. Yi Mubai helped Wen Yuan to sit down and poured her a glass of water. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. She smiled comfortably, as if she had finally let go of something that had been weighing on her heart for a long time. So did Yi Mubai. He was a man after all. Although he was sure of his own abilities, he was still very happy that it was related to Xiangnan's life and death. He sat beside her and called Yi Mulan back in the country. He also forgot about the time difference. Yi Mulan was sleeping when his phone rang. It was Mubai. He sat up quietly and took his phone out. As soon as he closed the door, he whispered, "What's wrong, Mubai?" Yi Mubai held the phone and coughed softly. Wen Yuan is pregnant. Am I awesome? Awesome, right? Yi Mulan stood at the door of the bedroom with his phone in his hand. He smiled warmly. That's good. I'll tell Mom and Dad that you shouldn't call them at this late hour. Only then did Yi Mubai remember that it was nighttime in the country. He smiled and said, I actually forgot. The two talked for a while before Yi Mulan hung up the phone. When he returned to the bedroom, his little wife was waiting for him. She was lying on the pillow, her hair was messy, and only her eyes were exposed. He looked at her fierce expression and couldn't help but smile. He closed the door softly and deliberately locked it. What's wrong? You look very much like. Hubby has a woman outside, don't you? She supported her chin with one hand and murmured, making a phone call in the middle of the night secretly, if it's not a woman, then what is it? Is it a wild man? End of this chapter. Recommend the Urban Guru, Lao Shi Xinshu. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version, M. Chapter 38-23. What nonsense are you talking about? He couldn't help but laugh. He sat over and flipped her over, spanking her a few times. Stop spouting nonsense. When did I like men? Bai Shuali was pressed down and spanked a few times. Her voice was trembling. You're a leader and you're not at home often. I don't know what your hobbies are either. Secretary Li won't tell me either. He snorted softly and hit her a few more times. You're getting better at talking, aren't you? Secretary Li is now in the same boat as you. She's my secretary, but she's more like your secretary, don't you think so? That's not true. She lay down and let him hit her. She would only moan a few times when he hit her fiercely to satisfy a certain man's perverted hobbies. She couldn't be clearer about what kind of person he liked. After messing around for a while, he placed her in his arms and reached out to rub his black hair. He said absent-mindedly, Mubai called and said that Wen Yuan is pregnant. Bai Shuali sat in his arms and looked up in surprise when she heard that. She played with his chin with her little hand and said very slowly, Yimubai, do you feel very upset in your heart? What do you mean by that? Nonsense. He was speechless. He looked at her and seemed to have thought of something. Oh right, Mubai seems to be the person you've always liked. She yelped and immediately threw herself into his arms. The person I like now is you. He smiled, reached out to pinch her chin, and bit her lightly. Then, are you willing to have another child with the person you like now? She smiled and bit back. I don't want to have a child, but I want to do something to have a child. Yi Mulin raised his eyebrows and turned over to press her down. You've learned to be bad. She hugged his neck and looked at him seductively. Yes, I've learned to be bad. Does Yi Mulin still like me? We'll know after we try. He kissed her slowly and confirmed again. You really don't want to have a child? She held his face and kissed him. We've been separated for so long before we got together. Yi Mulin, you're getting old and not suitable for having a child. Really? He gritted his teeth and said in a sinister voice. Shirley whimpered and obediently lay in his arms, doing whatever she wanted. She bit his shoulder and whispered countless compliments into his ear. At this time, she knew best what he liked to hear. Yimubai's phone call made by Shuali suffer a lot from her husband for the whole night. After that, she was washed clean and put on the bed. Yi Mulin came back from the shower and lay beside her. Looking at her weak appearance, he smiled and reached out to pinch her face. Next time you talk nonsense, I'll do this to you again. Actually, she was all ready. She was waiting for him to sleep. So she closed her eyes and fell asleep with him. It's all because of Xiao Bai. Yi Mulin smiled. You. I about to marry. She mumbled and moved her face closer to his neck. Then she sighed softly, Yi Mulin, when are we getting married? We have to have a status. I'm sleeping with him every day. She sounded a little aggrieved. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that way. Please remember the domain name of this book. Calm, Wonderful Book House mobile version. Calm. Chapter 38-24. He patted her but gently. Didn't you marry before? Are you going to marry again? Cece and Guze still want to hold a romantic wedding. Yi Mulin, you won't be so stingy, will you? She hugged him and acted coquettishly. Guze bought a really big diamond ring for her. I heard that he wants to kneel down and propose. Her face was full of longing. Yi Mulin was speechless. He pinched his wife's face and said, By Shuali, your husband is poor. Oh, then I'd better save some money. She obediently rested her head on his chest, then stupidly said, As long as you're up, it's fine. He nodded and said, By Shuali, I can't promise that you'll be wasteful every day, but I can promise that you'll be able to have fun every night. His rice worm immediately fell to the ground. What happened to being a serious husband? Of course, she knew that the reason why they couldn't hold a grand wedding was because of his identity. It was already amazing that he could be with her after a divorce. It wasn't good to hold a wedding that would cause a sensation. She didn't really want it from him. Anyway, it was fine as long as it was a small scene. She and Yi Mulin secretly held a small wedding banquet, which was just a family dinner. And Lin Cece and Guze's wedding was indeed grand. Because of Hingtong Group's global economic status, almost all the newspapers around the world published the news of their wedding. Including New York. In the afternoon, Yimubai sat quietly on the sofa reading the newspaper in his luxurious apartment in New York. The sun shone through the curtains and shone on him softly. He stared at the newspaper in his hand and didn't move for a long time. When Yuan woke up after an afternoon nap and went outside to drink a glass of water. When he came out, he saw Yimubai on the sofa. She wanted to call him, but she saw the newspaper in his hand. It was the news of Lin Cece's marriage. He stared at it and was a bit lost in thought. Her heart ached and she slowly walked over to pour herself a glass of water. At this moment, Yimubai noticed her coming out. He closed the newspaper and said with a faint smile, "You're awake." He naturally took her into his arms and held the cup for her to drink. Wen Yuan took small sips. After drinking half a cup, he stopped drinking. He put down the cup and reached out to rub her hair. "Are you okay?" She nodded, then looked at him, trying to find something in his face. His gaze was unfathomable as he smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" Wen Yuan broke away from him and sat beside him. His voice was very soft. "You saw her get married. So?" Yimubai gently rubbed her head. "You think too much." When Yuan put his hand on his abdomen and smiled lightly, "Yimubai, I know that she will always have a place in your heart." She also knew that in his heart, she was far more important in bed. She would never be able to get close to his soul. Men were like this. What they couldn't get would always be the moonlight. He might like her a little, but it was just a little, nothing more. It wasn't that when Yuan didn't feel a little sad. He didn't mean to hurt her, but her heart was still a little hurt. Every woman hoped that their husband only had her in his heart. When she found out that it wasn't, she couldn't help but feel disappointed, even if she already knew it. After Wen Yuan finished speaking, Yimubai frowned. "Wen Yuan, that was a long time ago." She looked up at him. "I can understand." Chapter 38-25. Yimubai was even more displeased. He glared at her for a few seconds before replying slowly, "You don't need to understand because it won't be a problem between us." Wen Yuan did not say anything. He still coaxed her and pulled her into his embrace, kissing her face. "I heard that pregnant women are very emotional. I didn't believe it in the past, but now I do." He kissed her lightly and coaxed her. "It's just in the past. And nothing happened between us." All adults knew what it meant to say that nothing had happened. It meant that they hadn't slept together. Wen Yuan understood. Actually, she knew better that it was because he cherished Lin Cece. With Yimubai, there were some things that were not easy to explain. For example, he lusted after Wen Yuan and doted on Lin Cece. Could he say these things to his wife? Of course not. Therefore, he might as well not say it. Some things would be better after a while. Later on, he threw away all the newspapers at home, not letting her see them. He did not read them either, and his heart was at peace. He spent more time at home, but he would also go out to work, but not for too long. He had film companies both in and out of the country. She could tell that he was preparing for his return in the future. She did not ask too much about his work and just stayed at home to take care of the baby. When Yuan was 5 months pregnant, Lin Danny called and said that she was near her house and wanted to meet her. When Yuan agreed and let Lin Danny come to the apartment. With the auntie at home, nothing would happen. After not seeing her for half a year, Lin Danny was different from before. She was not as spoiled as before and was more mature. She sat on the sofa and looked at the apartment, smiling. "I just wanted to have a chat with you today." "Oh right, don't think too much. I'm getting married." She took out an invitation. "There's an uncle's son who has been chasing after me for many years. I recently agreed." When Yuan picked it up and looked at the photo. He then smiled. "You two are quite compatible." Lin Danny just smiled and flipped her hair. "It's all right. I didn't know much in the past and always thought that love was greater than the sky. Actually, it's nothing much. It doesn't matter who you spend it with. Only someone who truly loves you." As she spoke, she smiled again. Actually, sometimes, if it's too hard, just let it go. There's nothing bad about that. Lin Danny left after chatting for a while. Of course, when Yuan wouldn't go to her wedding, and she didn't ask Yi Mubai if he would go. When Yi Mubai came back in the evening, he saw the invitation on the tea table. After taking a shower, he lay down on the bed. When Yuan seemed to be asleep, but he knew that she was not. He asked her softly, "Has Lin Danny been here?" "Yes." "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "Are you going?" Yi Mubai reaches out and rubs her hair. After thinking for a while, he says, "I have a lot of cooperation with Lin Danny's father, so I may have to attend. The wedding is in New York. When Yuan, come with me, okay?" She lowered her head. "I don't want to go over. You're my wife, and the baby is stable now. Besides, I don't want others to know that I have a wife." He didn't finish his sentence, but she understood. A good-looking, rich man like him, who was involved in the film and television industry, would have many women throwing themselves at him. When Yuan was probably because of this, so she agrees. Just this once. Chapter 38-26. Happy to see Lao Qing. 1 inch. Why don't you want to accompany me to socialize? When the child is born, accompany me and take it as a distraction, okay? He was still stroking her hair and his voice was a little hoarse. When Yuan looked down. "Yi Mubai, I don't like that kind of life anymore. I don't like the entertainment industry too much either. I don't want to get close to it." She didn't want to see all the women looking at her husband like that. She was afraid that she would think too much, so she would rather stay away from that circle. Yi Mubai looked at her quietly for a while. In the end, he didn't say anything and just helped her lie down. "Okay, let's go to sleep." She laid on her side in his arms. Her stomach was already 4 months old and it was already a little big. It was as though there was a layer of skin separating them, but after a while, she felt the changes in his body and his breathing became a little hurried. She rested her face on his shoulder and wanted to move away, but he pressed her head down. His voice was hoarse in the dark. "Don't move." She bit her lip and looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Yi Mubai turned his body and buried his face in her neck. His breathing was restrained. After a long time, when she thought he would let her go, he grabbed her hand and whispered, "When Yuan, we haven't done it for 4 months." Actually, they could do it, but he was always worried that they were different from other couples. Xiangnan couldn't take the risk. So every time he wanted to do it, he would suppress it. This time, he really couldn't take it anymore. When Yuan bit her lip and leaned in his arms, letting him do it. Her ears were filled with his suppressed and hoarse voice, showing his extreme joy. She didn't quite understand. Even if he chose to do it, why didn't he do it himself? Of course, as his wife, she couldn't refuse him, so she let him be. After a long time, he finally had enough and hugged her a little tighter. When Yuan lay in his arms and heard his rapid heartbeat, she bit her lip and felt a little helpless. After a while, he whispered in her ear, "Are you uncomfortable?" She shook her head. He smiled gently. "Liar." He was about to hit her when Yuan grabbed his hand and whispered, "I'm fine." He hesitated for a moment but decided to let her go. Actually, he knew that she was purposely suppressing herself for Xiangnan. She didn't even dare to enjoy herself like this. At that moment, his feelings were a little complicated, and he also lost interest. So in the few months after she was pregnant, they didn't have sex, not even tonight. If he couldn't hold it in anymore, he would go to the bathroom. Sometimes, when Yuan saw him like this, he would wonder if he would break down from holding it in too much. Most men wouldn't think about it as often as he did. In fact, their relationship had changed ever since Lin Cece got married, although they didn't say it out loud. On the day of Lin Danny's wedding, Wen Yuan and Yi Mu Bai went together. Because she was pregnant, she had chosen a V-neck, ash-gray dress. The hem of the dress was spread out to cover her slightly bulging belly and accentuate her slender waist. Her long hair was casually tied up, which made her seem more gentle. Her shoes were soft and mid-heeled, and she held a white sheepskin handbag in her hand. She looked especially good, which probably had something to do with Wen Yuan's family background. Even though she didn't socialize much, she was very good at picking out clothes, and she definitely wasn't stingy enough to bring them out. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-27. When she came out of the bedroom, Yi Mu Bai was stunned. Perhaps it was because he hadn't seen her at home for half a year that he wasn't used to it. He stared at her for a long time, but Wen Yuan misunderstood and said calmly, "Cosmetics are for pregnant women. There won't be a problem." He smiled and held her hand. "I'm just a little surprised, Wen Yuan." As he said that, he leaned forward and kissed her. Wen Yuan was stunned. He had already held her hand and walked out. Xiangnan wanted to pounce on him, but his parents had already left. Xiangnan said in a daze, "Mummy is so beautiful." Sigh, there was no place for him in the world of the two of them. Wen Yuan followed Yi Mu Bai downstairs. He drove a black Phantom and Wen Yuan sat in the back seat. Yi Mu Bai sat in the car and said calmly, "There's a cup in front with warm water in it. Drink some when you're thirsty. Don't drink any beverages or alcohol when you go to the reception later, understand?" His tone was a little domineering, which was rare. Wen Yuan nodded. "I know." Yi Mu Bai drove on the streets of New York and looked at the rearview mirror from time to time. Then, he smiled. "Wen Yuan, are you going to attend the wedding with a stepmother's face? Think about what the reporters will write. They will probably dig up the things between me and Lin Danny again." Wen Yuan bit his lips. "That has nothing to do with me. You're my wife. How is that not related?" He chuckled. "Be happy." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. Of course, she wouldn't put on an expression. However, she didn't want to pretend to be happy on purpose. That would be very fake. As for Yi Mu Bai, he just needed her to be normal. Tonight, a lot of celebrities attended, and it was the first time that Yi Mu Bai had brought his wife to socialize, so there were as many cameras on them as there were couples, especially Yi Mu Bai and Lin Danny. Fortunately, there was no news about Lin Danny's suicide abroad, so they didn't pay much attention to it. However, Wen Yuan's oriental temperament was very charming, so the foreigners kept clicking the shutter, thinking that she was the oriental Hepburn. Yi Mu Bai took care of her emotions, afraid that she wouldn't be used to it. In fact, how could a girl from the Wen family not be used to it? Besides, she had been Yi Mu Bai's nominal wife for a few years, so she had long been used to these occasions. In the banquet hall, she and Yi Mu Bai gave the gifts together and chatted for a while. Then he helped her sit down on the sofa. From time to time, people would come over to chat with them. Later, Yi Mu Bai needed to talk to a new project. It was not convenient here, so Wen Yuan politely asked him to talk to someone else, saying that she could do it alone. Yi Mu Bai and a few of the producers went to another corner to chat. Wen Yuan leaned against the wall and read a magazine for a while, eating some snacks. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was very good. It was said that a world-class violinist had been invited, and it was because both parties had a personal relationship. Wen Yuan listened and was dazed for a moment. Then she turned her head and saw a familiar face. She slowly stood up and looked at the young man who was playing the violinist. Kang Qiao. She murmured his name. The man in front of her smiled, finished playing a song, and put down the strings in his hand. Long time no see, Wen Yuan. Kong Qiao reached out to her, and Wen Yuan hesitantly put her hand in his. She thought it would be a handshake, but Kong Qiao gently pulled her into his arms and kissed her on the cheek. Are you alright? He just kissed her face. It was normal abroad. Although Wen Yuan was a little uncomfortable, she didn't make a fuss. She stood up straight and pursed her lips. I'm fine. Why are you here? I'm just that personal friendship. He smiled. I can't help it. As he said that, he put down the violinist and took a glass of red wine for her. He also took a glass for himself. Let's drink to our reunion. Wen Yuan wanted to refuse, but the glass in her hand was taken by a strong hand. Then, it was Yi Mubai's indifferent voice. Mr. Kong, my wife is pregnant and can't drink. Sorry. Chapter 38-28. Wen Yuan's body stiffened, and then he slowly looked at Yi Mubai. With an inscrutable expression on his face, he naturally put one hand around her waist, looked at Kong Qiao with a smile, and said to Wen Yuan, Don't you want to introduce him? Wen Yuan came back to his senses and forced a smile. My university tutor's son, Kong Qiao, is also a famous violinist. She paused for a moment. Kong Qiao, my husband, Yi Mubai. Kong Qiao's eyes fell on her face, and after a while, he said, I heard from my mother that you are married. With that, he reached out to Yi Mubai. Mr. Yi, I've heard about you for a long time. Yi Mubai also reached out to shake his hand. Mr. Kong, I've heard about you and your mother from Wen Yuan. Kong Qiao smiled and looked at Wen Yuan. Really? Wen Yuan was a little uncomfortable. When did she mention it to Yi Mubai? He was just talking nonsense. But Yi Mubai was very relaxed. He held the glass of red wine and clinked it with Kong Qiao. Mr. Kong, are you in New York recently? Kong Qiao's eyes fell on Wen Yuan's face. Just for a week, and then I'll go to Europe. He still had something to do, so he didn't chat with them for too long. Wen Yuan, contact me when you return to China. My mother misses you very much. Wen Yuan nodded. I will. Kong Qiao's eyes fell on her face, and then moved to her lower abdomen. Finally, he said hoarsely, I haven't congratulated you yet. It was probably because the regret in his eyes was too obvious, and the way he looked at her was not like a senior brother looking at a junior sister, but purely like a man looking at a woman. Wen Yuan couldn't ignore it, and of course, Yi Mubai could see it even more clearly. This man had such thoughts about his wife. Wen Yuan also felt uncomfortable. He reached out and touched his hair. Thank you. Their eyes met and stared at each other for a few seconds. Kong Qiao left, and after a while, Alice was played. Wen Yuan looked up and met Yi Mubai's gaze. There was a hint of contemplation in his eyes. He drank the red wine in his glass and asked casually, Were you on good terms with him before? Wen Yuan was still a little uncomfortable. He pursed his lips and said, Because of his mother, I'm asking about your relationship. Wen Yuan, have you ever liked him? Yi Mubai asked very straightforwardly. He didn't care about the occasion. He just looked around and asked directly. There was a reason why he asked this question. Kong Qiao was handsome and famous all over the world. He must have attracted a lot of girls when he was young. Wen Yuan seemed to like this type of guy. He, Yi Mubai, reeked of money. Would she still like him? Wen Yuan frowned at his direct question, but still answered, no. Then, did he like you? He asked immediately. This time, Wen Yuan didn't answer him immediately. He sat down and ate for a while before saying, no. Liar. He looked at her condescendingly. His eyes were a little deep. When Yuan looked up and met his unfathomable eyes. For a long time, they didn't speak, and the atmosphere was very subtle. There was a slap, and there was Konkola's Alice. Yimubai suddenly leaned forward and whispered in her ear, Kong Chiao played it for you to hear, didn't he? She wanted to deny it, but Yimubai's finger gently touched her lips. I don't believe you haven't heard it. Chapter 38-29. The scene of Kong Ji looking at his wife lovingly while Wen Yuan was playing the piano appeared in his mind. Just thinking about it made him feel uncomfortable. Wen Yuan frowned again. Yimubai, you really think too much. You know very well whether I think too much or not, okay? He pressed his finger on her lips, hinting at her. Later, he went to socialize again, but as soon as Wen Yuan looked up, she could see him looking at her thoughtfully, as if he was catching her in the act. Wen Yuan felt a little annoyed. Later, Kong Chao didn't come to talk to her again, probably because he noticed something. It wasn't until the wedding buffet was over and Wen Yuan and Yimubai left that Kong Chao came over and handed her a business card. Call me if you need anything in the future. Wen Yuan nodded. Okay, senior brother. I will. Kong Chao's eyes were still on her face. After a while, he smiled. Okay, let's go back. It's getting late. However, his own gaze was still on her face. As a man, Yimubai could see the strong reluctance in his heart. His heart was sour as he held onto Wen Yuan's waist and smiled. Wen Yuan, we should go. You're pregnant, you should rest more. Wen Yuan knew that he did it on purpose, but he had no choice but to smile at Kong Chiao and leave with him. Yimubai drank. The driver drove the car, and he sat in the back seat with Wen Yuan. Sitting in the back seat, Kong Chiao's voice was very light. Did you have a good time tonight? Wen Yuan was a little tired. He leaned against the seat, squinted his eyes, and said in a lazy voice, What do you mean? Yimubai leaned over, and his nose was filled with a faint smell of alcohol. The mellow fragrance mixed with the man's breath was very tempting. He stared at her face and didn't say anything. He just reached out and rubbed her earlobe. You should take a rest first. Wen Yuan thought that the matter was over. She was really tired, so she closed her eyes slightly. She didn't wake up until the car stopped in front of the apartment. The driver was already gone, and there were only the two of them. She yawned. We're here. Just as she was about to get out of the car, Yimubai helped her put on his jacket and said softly, You look distracted. Strangely, she found a trace of jealousy in his words. She asked softly, Yimubai, are you jealous? No. He held her with one arm and took her bag with the other, leading her into the elevator. She still wanted to say something, but he had already leaned over and kissed her hard and hurried, hurting her lips. Yimu. Bye. Her voice was intermittent. She clenched her fists and tried to push him away, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move him away. He kept trapping her, not letting her move an inch. His kiss was also completely invading her. His breath touched her, and with every breath they took, it seeped into her limbs. She had no strength to resist, and her legs were so weak that her body slid down. Yimubai held her waist with one hand and kissed her even more deeply. Wen Yuan didn't know what was wrong with him, but she vaguely felt that it had something to do with Kong Chao. She tried to explain, but her voice was muffled. He stopped and stared at her with a burning gaze. Then, he kissed her again under her gaze. Wen Yuan was helpless and could only let him kiss her. She wanted to say that their elevator had been stopped for a long time, and it was opening and closing. At this time, their auntie came out. She stood at the door and saw them kissing in the elevator. The auntie was stunned for a moment and wanted to avoid it, but Yimubai noticed her presence. Chapter 38:30. They had stopped kissing, but the atmosphere was quite subtle. The auntie cleared her throat uncomfortably. I'm going to take out the trash. Yimubai nodded and walked out of the elevator with Wen Yuan. The elderly auntie almost jumped into the elevator. Oh yeah, I'll go back later. I won't be coming back. As for the trash can, she would take it home. The elevator door closed. Wen Yuan flicked her hair and lowered her head, not saying a word. Yimubai swiped the door and turned sideways. Let's go home. She looked up at him and felt that his gaze was a bit unfathomable. He followed her in as soon as she entered, and then he caught her hand. She called his name. Yimubai. He carried her and walked towards the master bedroom. Wen Yuan was nervous. She had a vague premonition of what he wanted to do. Her fingers tugged at the clothes on his shoulders. I'm pregnant. He didn't hear it. There was a touch of indifference on his handsome face. She hadn't seen him like this for a long time. She was a little afraid that he would hurt the child. This wasn't just a child, but also Xiangnan's life. She felt that no matter how irrational he was, he shouldn't joke about Xiangnan. So when he put her on the soft bed, she felt uneasy. There's nothing between me and Kong Qiao. Don't think too much. He bent his knees on both sides of her and touched her red lips with his fingers. He smiled. I didn't mention him. Why do you look like you're guilty? I didn't. She turned her face away because his gaze was too aggressive. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. At this time, he didn't want to talk to her either. He just wanted to have her and prove that she was his. She was pregnant. No matter how rough he was, he still retained a bit of gentleness. However, the whole process was really not something a pregnant woman could bear. Moreover, they hadn't done it for a few months. Wen Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Later, he only let her go after she cried so hard. However, it was already very late at night. Yimubai let out a sigh of relief. After being fierce, his body felt comfortable, but he also felt a little regretful. Wen Yuan was quite miserable. She lay there for a long time without moving, just lightly panting. Yimubai kissed her eyebrows and asked in a low voice, Are you okay? Another tear slid down the corner of Wen Yuan's eye. She didn't want to talk to him. Yimubai also knew that he was a bit harsh just now. His voice was slightly hoarse. All right, I'm not angry anymore. Did I make you uncomfortable? Yimubai, you bastard. She was so angry that she slowly turned her back to him. He laughed lowly and hugged her from behind. Are you angry? He knew that she had feelings for him, but tonight, he was mainly relying on his feelings. It was impossible for her to enjoy it. She probably hated him to the core, right? Hugging her, his fingers slowly moved down to gently rub her stomach. Then, he asked in a low and hoarse voice, Tell me, did he confess to you? Wen Yuan knew who he was talking about. She was silent for a moment. No, really. I believe you, he said generously. Then he murmured, but he likes you. Wen Yuan, I don't believe that you can't sense it. As he spoke, he gently bit her earlobe. He was a little unwilling, but there was also an indescribable feeling in his heart. Wen Yuan didn't answer his question. He was right. She could feel it. She knew it when she was young. However, at that time, Kong Qiao wanted to go abroad. He never said anything, so she pretended not to know. Later on, she was infatuated with Yimubai. Kong Qiao seemed to have disappeared from her life. However, at this moment, when she thought back to the past, it was actually very beautiful. Chapter 38-31. She didn't say anything, which aroused his dissatisfaction. He bit her again. What are you thinking about? When Yuan's fingers gently stroked the pillow, she suddenly had a wicked idea. She smiled. I was thinking that if Kong Qiao had told me at that time, and I had promised him, would it have been, as soon as she finished speaking, her body was pulled over by him. He pinned her on the pillow. It was a little overbearing, but he didn't forget to be gentle to her. He carefully avoided her stomach. Wen Yuan. His expression was a little scary, which she had never seen before. For a moment, she looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. He continued, "You're not allowed to see him in the future." She closed her eyes. "He is my teacher's son. Yimubai, don't think too much about it. I won't go out of my way to meet him, but I won't avoid him either. That would be too problematic." Yimubai looked at her quietly. He originally wanted to force her, but when he saw Wen Yuan like this, he gave up. She had never been a weak woman, as he had thought. She was resolute and crafty, and his attraction had come too suddenly. He turned to the side and lay quietly for a while. Then he said, "I'll take you to the shower." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He carried her to the shower and carried her back to the bed in the bedroom to help her wipe. His breathing became chaotic again. After all, he was a man who hadn't had sex for several months. Wen Yuan's eyes opened a slit and looked at him. Then he said in a low voice, "Just now, you wanted enough. Now, even if you want more, I don't have the strength to accompany you." She almost sighed and said, "Yimubai, I want to sleep for a while." Yimubai looked at her condescendingly. He put down his hand that was originally on her shoulder, which meant that he was letting her go. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "You sleep." Wen Yuan fell asleep quickly, but he didn't feel sleepy. He went outside to smoke a cigarette. He wanted to see Xiangnan, but his eyes bumped into her bag. He went over to sit on the sofa and took out a business card from her bag. It was given to her by Kong Qiao. Yimubai stared at it for a long time. Finally, he took a lighter and burned it. Flirting in front of him, after the fever was over, he felt refreshed and went back to his room to sleep. Wen Yuan had slept with him fiercely at night, and she was pregnant for several months, so she woke up late. When she woke up, it was already past 10 o'clock. She opened her eyes and sat up. She heard Xiangnan and Yimubai talking outside. "He's still at home." Wen Yuan lowered her face and placed her hand on her abdomen. Her abdomen moved slightly. She could feel the child moving. Perhaps he was a little impatient after being tormented by his father last night. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. Thinking back to last night, he seemed to be so angry that he acted like this. Or maybe he couldn't hold it in anymore. Wen Yuan got up to brush her teeth and wash her face before going out. Yimubai was reading a book with Xiangnan in his arms. When he saw her coming out, he put Xiangnan down and naturally prepared breakfast for her. Wen Yuan sat down and ate breakfast in silence. Yimubai stared at her. Finally, she couldn't stand his gaze and looked up. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He coughed softly. "Are you okay now?" Wen Yuan's face heated up. She then said in a low voice, "You didn't ask last night. Don't you think it's too late to ask now?" He said in a low voice, "Then I'll ask you the next time I do it. Tomorrow, which is Friday, will be updated at noon. 15 chapters. This is not the most explosive chapter, the most explosive chapter is yet to come. Chapter 38-32. When Yuan ignored him and continued to eat his breakfast, in the afternoon, Yimubai went to the company in New York. When Yuan went to look through Kong Qiao's business card, She and Kong Chiao used to have a good relationship. She wanted to save his phone number, but she couldn't find it in her bag. She was a little puzzled. She had clearly put it in her bag. Later, she saw Yimubai's cigarettes and the lighter on the coffee table. She took a look at the trash can and there were obvious ashes in it. She was furious. He didn't even cover up what he did. Wen Yuan was a little angry. He stared at it for a long time but didn't say anything in the end. Yimubai came home very late. When he got home, Wen Yuan and Xiangnan were already asleep. He entered the bedroom quietly and went straight to the bathroom without turning on the light. When he came back and lay on the bed, he reached out and touched Wen Yuan. "Are you asleep?" She didn't move. He smiled. "I know you're not asleep." Wen Yuan was angry with him but didn't say anything. He didn't care if he could ignore him. He leaned against the headboard and pinched her face. "I know you're not asleep. Are you angry?" Wen Yuan couldn't help but slap his hand away. "Yimubai, you know why I'm angry. Because I burned Kong Chiao's business card," he said coldly and indifferently. Wen Yuan was furious. "Yimubai, in your heart, I'm just an accessory, a tool for you to give birth to a child, am I right?" He retracted his fingers that were stroking her hair and said indifferently, "Do you think I'll be willing to let you hang out with someone who admires you?" Wen Yuan sat down. Sensing that he was about to lie down and sleep, she pursed her lips and said in a soft voice, "You and Lin Danny are far more than just love. Didn't you go to her wedding and the award ceremony as well?" "Did I say anything?" Lu Yanchen was speechless. "You and Lin Danny are way more than just love." Yimubai opened his eyes. "Wen Yuan, are you going to bring up the past with me?" "No, I just want to say that we are equal. I don't want my normal contact to be restricted by you," Wen Yuan said calmly. After saying that, he sat up again and frowned. "Lin Danny and I are needed for work. Kong Chiao, is it? Is it necessary to keep in touch?" Wen Yuan raised her head and stared at him. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't understand. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "Yimubai, I realize that I can't talk to you clearly. He likes you." That was what he minded. Wen Yuan chuckled. "Lin Danny doesn't like you. You've even hugged and kissed. Yimubai, you're a double standard now." He turned on the light, stared at her, and said word by word, "You don't want to see Kong Chiao, I don't want to see Lin Danny either. These are two different things." Wen Yuan felt a little tired and looked down. "Yimubai, you're still not getting to the point. There's nothing going on between me and Kong Chiao. We're just old friends. Why can't we keep in touch?" His breath caught in his throat and he asked her softly, "Do you want to be in contact with him?" Wen Yuan stared at his expression and said very slowly, "I can't talk to you." She didn't want to argue with him, so she lifted the covers and got up. "I'll sleep in the guest room." Just as he stood up, his wrist was caught by a hand. "You sleep here. I'll sleep in the guest room," he whispered and brought her back. However, he didn't put her under the covers but held her in his arms. Chapter 38-33. Wen Yuan struggled. "Yimubai, what are you doing?" He wasn't cold when he hugged her, but they were in a cold war. What was he doing now? Yimubai hugged her and placed her in his arms. He lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "I'm jealous." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. She just leaned in his arms and bit his shoulder gently. She had an indescribable grievance in her heart, but she couldn't say it out loud. From the start to the end, she only liked him. And she knew that there were countless women by his side in the past, but now, because of Kong Chiao's business card, they had fallen out like this. She was a little sad. The unfairness between them could only mean one thing. He didn't see her as an equal. He said that he was jealous. Wasn't she angry? When Yuan didn't say anything. After he kissed her, he didn't go to the guest room and hugged her to sleep. The matter with Kong Chiao was left unsettled. After all, life still had to go on. But then, when Yuan bumped into Kong Chiao in the hospital. He came to the hospital to visit someone he knew as a farewell. When Yuan happened to bump into him during her prenatal checkup. Moreover, Yimubai had something to do today, so Su Mo accompanied her. Kong Chiao was surprised to bump into him on the stairs. Then, she smiled lightly. We meet again. When Yuan smiled too. What a coincidence. Su Mo looked at them and pointed to the front. You guys chat. I'll talk to the doctor first. When Yuan nodded. After Su Mo walked far away, she sat on the bench with Kong Chiao. You're leaving New York. He nodded. Yes, I'm leaving. Didn't Sir accompany you to the prenatal checkup? When Yuan was stunned. Oh, he had something to do today. Then, there was silence. When Yuan then found a topic. How is teacher? He had a heart operation the year before last. He's doing well now. Kong Chiao sighed. So I'll probably come back to develop my career in the next 2 years. My mother needs someone to take care of her. When Yuan nodded. Yes. Kong Chiao hesitated for a moment. Does he treat you well? When Yuan was stunned for a moment before he smiled. Not bad. Kong Chiao stared at her eyes. There was a faint flame, but he restrained himself, not revealing it, nor would he give her pressure. After all, she was already a wife. Kong Chiao coughed lightly. Oh right, let's have a meal later. When Yuan couldn't refuse because Kong Chiao's mother treated her very, very well. She often practiced the piano at the Kong residence and was very familiar with Kong Chiao. She thought that if it weren't for the fact that she was infatuated with Yi Mubai, the person she would eventually marry would most likely be Kong Chiao. She looked down. All right. Your phone, he suddenly said. When Yuan looked at him in surprise. He smiled again. My phone. I'll save my number. She was a little touched that he didn't expose her. She gave him the phone and he dialed his number to save it for her. When he put away the phone, he asked in a low voice, It won't be hard for you to have dinner with me, right? He was afraid that Yimubai would make things difficult for her. In Kong Chiao's heart, he liked Wen Yuan, but he could only give his blessings for her marriage. He could only hide everything else in his heart. Wen Yuan shook his head. No. She smiled at him. I'm not such a useless person. Kong Chiao's eyes were stained with some pain. He didn't know what to say. Chapter 38-34. She was right. She was not a useless girl. She had her principles. He had always thought that when she grew up and became famous, she would be waiting for him there. But when he turned around, she fell in love with someone else. At that time, when he returned to China, they sat under a tree and drank beer. She told him that she had never seen a man as handsome as Yimubai and that she wanted to pursue him. At that time, he felt bitter. He wanted to tell her that he liked her, but he saw the little stars in her eyes. It was a Wen Yuan that he had never seen before. For love, regardless of anything. Later on, she married Yi Mulin. When they met again, her wish came true. She stood beside Yi Mubai and became Mrs. Yi. Wen Yuan had never been someone who could be bullied easily. She was just good at enduring silently. She was a young lady with a contradictory personality, but he liked this kind of personality. Kong Chao smiled and couldn't help putting his hand in the air. It seemed that he wanted to stroke her hair or touch her face. But his hand stayed in the air for a long time. Finally, his voice was a little hoarse. I'll go to the restaurant opposite first. Come back after the checkup. I'll wait for you. Wen Yuan nodded. At the other end of the aisle, Su Mo held her breath. In fact, she could see that Kong Chao liked Wen Yuan very much. His eyes were very gentle. She had a feeling that Wen Yuan would be happier with Kong Chao than with her boss. But she couldn't help it. Su Mo thought to herself that she would never tell her boss what happened today. But it didn't mean that Yi Mubai didn't know. Su Mo accompanied Wen Yuan to the checkup. The baby was all right. Wen Yuan looked at Su Mo and didn't hide it. I asked Kong Chao to have dinner together. Come with us. Of course, Su Mo refused. You guys go ahead. I'll eat alone. I'll wait for you in the car. Then she blinked. I won't tell Director Yi. Don't worry. Wen Yuan smiled. He's just an old friend. Su Mo also smiled. But in her heart, she thought, but Director Yi will be angry and jealous. Don't think that I can't see it. The atmosphere was subtle. Su Mo waved her hand and ran away. After a while, she came back. I'll send you there. Mr. Kong, please send it back. She was always worried. As the special assistant, she felt that this baby was particularly important to the night couple. Wen Yuan didn't refuse. He let Su Mo accompany him to the restaurant that Kong Chao had booked. The place was pretty good. Kong Chao also invited Su Mo to eat together, but Su Mo refused. After Su Mo left, Kong Chao smiled. This little assistant is quite interesting. Wen Yuan flipped his hair and looked at him. Do you want me to introduce her to you? She's quite nice. She's 28 years old and suits you well. After she finished speaking, Kong Chao remained silent for a long time. After a long while, Kong Chao poured her a cup of warm water. Then he said in a low voice, why did you change your career to be a matchmaker? Do I look like I'm lacking a girlfriend? Wen Yuan was a little embarrassed. He smiled faintly and said, that's true, you don't lack girlfriends. While Kong Chao was ordering, he didn't ask her what she liked to eat, because he clearly knew what she liked to eat. While ordering, he looked up and smiled at her. But I don't have a girlfriend right now. Wen Yuan was a little speechless. Kong Chao, you're having a bad taste now. In the car, Wen Yuan gently caressed the box, feeling a bit complicated. Kong Chao's words to her kept ringing in her ears. She also admitted that she gave up her dreams for a man, and she became not quite like herself. This kind of life, was it really what she wanted? This kind of man was not what she had imagined before. Wen Yuan suddenly realized that her life was actually a mess. Other than Yi Mubai, she actually had nothing. She raised her head, a teardrop at the corner of her eye. Su Mo was a little shocked when she saw this from the side. She said in a low voice, don't let the night guide see you like this, otherwise he might not be happy. End of chapter. Chapter 38-36. Promise me you'll never see him again. Wen Yuan looked up at Su Mo and smiled. Thank you. To her, Concho was a witness to her past dreams, which was wonderful. Su Mo could understand. She was very grateful. Su Mo shook her hand and smiled. Wen Yuan, can I call you Wen Yuan? Wen Yuan nodded. Su Mo said, in the past, I wanted to be a writer, but in the end, I only became a small assistant, and Ping Xiong's assistant at that. Wen Yuan was surprised. Su Mo coughed lightly. My ears are very sharp. Then, they looked at each other and smiled. Wen Yuan's sadness disappeared without a trace. When they arrived at the apartment, Su Mo left first. The housekeeper said that Xiangnan was taking an afternoon nap and asked if Wen Yuan had eaten. I ate outside. Wen Yuan said softly, and then she went back to her bedroom. She took out the box and carefully found a place to put it. She threw the box away because she was afraid that Yimubai would see it. She had been looking at it the whole afternoon. She suddenly felt a little happy in her heart, as if she had found a little bit of her past, and even felt a little free. Yimubai came home a little early. The auntie left during dinner. Yimubai didn't say anything at first. It wasn't until Xiangnan went to bed that he walked into the bedroom. Wen Yuan had finished showering and was wearing a bathrobe. His belly was bulging. She sits on the sofa and blow-dries her hair. Yimubai reaches for a towel and says, I'll help you dry it. It'll be dry after a while. It's not good to use too much of a pregnant hairdryer. Wen Yuan nodded and leaned back on the sofa, letting him take care of her. She didn't ask him what he did when he was out for a day, because she couldn't help and didn't like to meddle in a man's business. Yimubai, on the other hand, asked about her prenatal checkup and how the baby was. Wen Yuan leaned back comfortably with his eyes half closed. The child is fine. The ultrasound report is in the bag. Take a look at it yourself. He didn't say anything. He just dried her hair and carried her to the bed. Wen Yuan thought he was going to look at the prenatal checkup report, but he didn't leave for a long time. Wen Yuan opened his eyes. What's wrong? Yimubai's fingers gently stroke her face, and his voice is a little hoarse. Wen Yuan, am I not good enough to you? She shook her head, closed her eyes, and smiled. Why do you ask? He was very close to her, and the tip of his nose moved over to smell the fragrance of her body. After a while, his voice became even more hoarse. Do you like your current life? She opened her eyes and looked straight into his. His eyes were fixed on her, and he had no intention of moving away. Therefore, Wen Yuan knew that he had something to say to her, or he knew something. However, what she couldn't understand was that he had been very calm since he came back. She chuckled softly. You're quite patient. The tip of his nose gently touched hers. Wen Yuan, if I don't ask, you won't tell me, right? Say what? She didn't avoid his gaze and smiled lightly. Do you think there's anything else I need to say to you? Her smile was a little self-deprecating. Don't I even have the freedom to have a meal with a familiar friend? I remember we discussed this. He murmured, and his hand gently held her chin. Don't you remember? When Yuan's fingers clenched into a fist, and she said patiently, I didn't agree to anything. I also said that Kong Chiao is just a friend. There was nothing between me and him in the past, and there won't be anything between me and him in the future. Isn't that enough for Yimubai? Do you want me to avoid my mentor's son? End of this chapter. Chapter 38-37. I promise not to see him again. I promise not to see him again. He stared at her, not letting go of any changes in her expression. Wen Yuan, I mind. Wen Yuan looked at him for a long time before looking away. Are you following me? He didn't deny it. Su Mo will be fine if you don't see him. Wen Yuan was a little shocked. She turned to look at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. If she didn't see him, then what would happen to Su Mo? Under her gaze, Yimubai said calmly, Su Mo won't be able to find a job in the industry. When Yuan's annual salary is about 100,000 US dollars, and her family's annual expenses are about 600,000 to 700,000 US dollars. I forgot to tell you that she has a sick brother, and she needs to spend a lot of money. When Yuan looked at him with eyes that seemed to be quenched by ice. She had never thought that Yimubai was such a heartless man. She remembered that when she was infatuated with him, he was gentle to everyone. Even though he was heartless to her later on, he was still gentle to others. I don't believe it, she spat out. Yimubai smiled faintly. When Yuan, you don't really understand men. In other words, men are male animals, and they are very protective of their territory. When Yuan looked at him and said softly, is it because you don't have confidence, or because you don't think that you're good enough to make me fall head over heels for you? Yimubai, it's because you don't intend to give up everything, so you're using this method, right? If he had given his heart and given up everything, he wouldn't have needed to use this method to keep her. She could tell that he didn't want her to work or interact with other men. The only time she could go out was with him. It was as though she was going to be turned into an accessory by him. And yet, he seemed to be asking her to agree and be willing. She found it ridiculous. She looked at him as though he was a stranger and said softly, Yimubai, did you do this when you liked Lin Cece? Did you ask her to not see anyone else, not even Guzay? She finally couldn't help but say what was in her heart, or is it because you lost to Guzay that you have a shadow in your heart that you would use such a method to lock up a woman? Yimubai's expression turned ugly. He stared at her for a long time without saying anything. When Yuan laughed self-deprecatingly. I overestimated myself. She thought too much. She thought those desires were true love. His liking was just liking, and it was far from love. From the past till now, he had only loved Lin Cece. But now, when Yuan realized to his horror that Lin Cece was the only one he loved. Yimubai stood up and said faintly, when Yuan, you're thinking too much. No husband would want his wife to meet someone else in private and have an affair with someone else. When Yuan stared at him for a long time before he walked to the door. She stopped him, Yimubai. He paused at the door. Have you thought it through? When Yuan looked at his back and lowered her eyes. Her long eyelashes couldn't stop trembling. She couldn't even control her fingers, which were also trembling. She said softly with a hint of disillusionment in her eyes, I promise you that I won't see Kong Chiao in the future. Don't make things difficult for Su Mo. She gently got out of bed and took out the SIM card. She walked into the bathroom and flushed the toilet. She took out the beautiful crystal piano and held it in front of him. Yimubai looked at her. End of this chapter. Chapter 38. Promise me that you won't see him again. When Yuan was standing in front of him under the light. He had black hair and white clothes. She looked up at him, and the corner of her beautiful mouth moved slightly. Then she smiled, and there was a tear at the corner of her eye. She said, Yimubai, you weren't like this before. He was still staring at her. She was still smiling faintly, but her smile was uglier than crying. She looked like a very sad child. She didn't even wipe the tears that fell from the corner of her eyes. She just stared at him. Is it because you don't care about me that I don't have to worry about my dreams and feelings? Do I have to obey everything you say? Yimubai, tell me, is that right? He looked at her quietly. If you don't see him, we will be fine. Then what if I ask you not to see Lin Cece? When Yuan's mouth trembled. Will you be willing? Yimubai didn't answer her. He was still angry with her. Did she have to fight with him like this for Conchao? When Yuan's tears fell down one by one. She didn't wipe them away, but let them fall one by one. I can never be in your heart like she is, right? Yimubai frowned. When Yuan, you think too much. It's not that I think too much. Her voice became a little sharp. You have always treated me like this. Yimubai, even if you have a trace of patience, you would not use this way to deal with the matter between me and Conchao. I didn't cheat on you. You had someone follow me, and all I did was have a meal. Suemo knew about it from the beginning. You told me not to contact you. I'm Wen Yuan, not your cat or dog. She scratched her head. This is not the kind of life I want. Yimubai stared at her and said in a cold voice, what kind of life do you want? Let you be free to run around the world, surrounded by your admirers. He took a step forward. You're Xiangnan's mother, and we'll have another child in the future. Wen Yuan, I'm very busy. I have to take care of you and Xiangnan. I don't have much time and energy to invest in relationships. So, I might hurt your self-esteem by doing this, but it's good for both of us. Wen Yuan was stunned for a long time. She slowly looked up at him. Do you think I'll find someone else when I'm lonely? He didn't say anything. Wen Yuan stared at her, waiting for her answer. So she knew that their past, her marriage with Yi Mulan, wasn't something he didn't care about. There were some things he just didn't ask. In his heart, she was not clean. Marrying her and having children was just making do. Maybe, he liked her a little bit, but he hoped for more. At this moment, Wen Yuan understood. Yimubai was still Yimubai, but he was different from before. He was Yimubai in the Vanity Fair. He was no longer the Prince Charming who was willing to coax Lin Cece. Wen Yuan didn't quarrel or make a fuss. She just held the crystal piano. Yimubai also looked at it. He knew that it was a gift from Conchao. She treated it like a treasure since she came back. What he cared about was not the present, but the past. With such a man around, if there was any trouble between him and Wen Yuan, that man might take over his position. He didn't want any scandals in their marriage. Yimubai wanted to say something, but Wen Yuan's hand loosened. The expensive gift in her hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the ground. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-39. When the fragments fell to the ground, they reflected light and stung her eyes. Her eyes were quickly stained with tears, and she said very softly, I know. Yimubai was also stunned for a moment. He didn't want her to meet Conchao, but it didn't mean that he would break things. Now that she had broken them, he didn't know what to say. When Yuan said softly, I'll clean them up tomorrow. I want to sleep for a while now. After she finished speaking, she quietly walked to the bed and lay down. Yimubai looked at her and frowned. Wen Yuan, let's talk. She didn't say anything, but just lay there quietly, crying quietly. Yimubai walked over and half knelt beside her. Don't cry. She turned her face away. I don't want to see you. The same person had disillusioned her twice. How naive was she to think that after they got married and he doted on her for a few days, she thought that she was the white moon in his heart. She, Wen Yuan, was just an old maid who warmed his bed. Conchao was right. She had lost herself. She had been chasing after a man. She had forgotten that her name was Wen Yuan, and she had forgotten her dreams. She now thought that if she hadn't clung to him so awkwardly, he wouldn't have treated her like such a jerk. Wen Yuan buried her face in the pillow and cried silently. She hadn't been so fragile before. Maybe she had been spoiled by someone for a few days and became unreasonable. Yimubai's heart was a little painful. He regretted it a little, but he didn't take back his words. Because he really didn't want her to see Conchao. That man was too much of a threat to him. He didn't know why, he just didn't want her to see him. However, countless times later, Yimubai regretted that he didn't coax her that night. He didn't untie the knot in her heart. He just watched her sleep, and he just cleaned up the fragments. He slept in the guest room. At dawn, he received a call from Guze. He said that Lin Cece was in a car accident and only Qin Chen could perform the surgery. Qin Chen was in a meeting in New York and could not be contacted at the moment. Yimubai answered the phone and immediately put on his clothes. Before he went out, he went back to the master bedroom, half knelt in front of her and kissed her face. "When Yuan, I have to go out for a while. It may take 2 or 3 days. Auntie will be here soon. Let's talk about what happened before when we come back, okay?" Her face was a little pale. He thought she didn't sleep well, so he reached out and touched her face. "If you're tired, sleep for a while. I'll let Xiangnan dress himself." When Yuan opened his eyes. "Where are you going?" He was stunned. He shouldn't have told the truth, but he didn't want to lie to her. He said in a hoarse voice, "Cece got into a car accident. Qin Chen is in New York. I'll send Qin Chen back to B City. I'll be back soon." When Yuan opened his eyes and looked at him. "I'm not feeling well. Be good, be good." He kissed her. "I'm only going for 2 or 3 days. I'm sorry about last night." When Yuan blinked a little sadly. "Are you sorry because of Lin Cece? You want to rush to her side, don't you?" Yimubai frowned. When Yuan, don't think like that. He was always in a hurry to find Qin Chen, so he didn't care too much about her. When he got up, when Yuan grabbed his sleeve again. "Mubai, I'm really not feeling well. I want to go to the hospital." His expression was vaguely impatient, but he still tried to comfort her. "Wait for me to come back. I'll accompany you for a prenatal checkup, okay? Please remember the domain name of this book, .com. Wonderful Book House." Chapter 3840. When Yuan clasped his hand tightly, looking a little lost. "You don't believe me?" He paused for a moment. "When Yuan, it's not the time to be willful. Cece needs me to find Qin Chen." When Yuan's face flashed with a touch of disappointment. She murmured, "I need you too." Yimubai leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Be good, I'll be back soon." He still broke free from her, walked out, and disappeared in front of her. He chose not to believe her and chose to go to another girl. The door outside closed with a soft sound. He left. When Yuan turned sideways and her whole body was stiff. She blinked gently and then smiled bitterly. She propped herself up and picked up the phone on the bedside table. She wanted to call Su Mo, but when she picked up the phone, a pool of blood slowly flowed out from under her white bathrobe, and her vision was slowly dyed red. Her fingers trembled and she used the last bit of her strength to call Yimubai. She wanted him to come back, she wanted to tell him that the child might be gone. At this moment, she was very afraid. She was afraid that the child would be gone, and she was afraid that Xiangnan would be gone. If it was really gone, she would really have nothing left. The phone rang again and again. She listened to it absent-mindedly. Then he didn't answer the phone and hung up. The phone slipped from Wen Yuan's hand. Her hand touched the bathrobe, and it was full of blood. The child was fine yesterday, but now, was it going to be gone? She made a hoarse voice. She wanted to call Xiangnan, but she was afraid of scaring Xiangnan. Fortunately, the aunt came. Probably because she smelled the blood, the aunt slowly came over and then screamed, "Oh my God, how could this happen?" She ran over, and when Yuan grabbed her hand. Before she lost consciousness, she whispered, "You must save this child." The aunt was about to cry. Don't talk, save your strength. The aunt called Mr. Yi, but he didn't answer, so she could only call Su Mo. Su Mo directly arranged a car to send Wen Yuan to the hospital. Later, he also kept calling Yimubai, but no one answered, and then his phone was turned off. For a day and a night, he couldn't contact Yimubai because his phone was out of battery and he couldn't turn it on the plane. When he found out that Wen Yuan had a miscarriage, he was in B City. When he heard Su Mo's hoarse voice say that there was only a 20% chance, Yimubai stood at the airport of B City, his whole body covered in ice. He remembered that when he left home yesterday, Wen Yuan held his hand and told him that she wasn't feeling well and that she needed to go to the hospital. However, he was worried about Lin Cici's condition, so he left her and chose to look for Qin Qin. He didn't even dare to imagine what Wen Yuan was thinking or feeling when he left. Previously, because of Kong Qiao and the others' quarrel, he thought it was just a quarrel between husband and wife. After the quarrel, they would reconcile, just like the last time. However, he did not expect that she would be so uncomfortable that she would have a miscarriage. Yimubai immediately took a special plane back to New York. When he arrived at the hospital, it was already 38 hours later, but Wen Yuan had not woken up yet, and the child in her belly was not out of danger. Yimubai looked at the plain white wall and quickened his pace. Su Mo was guarding at the door. When he saw him coming, his eyes were red. "She's not awake yet?" Yimubai asked in a trembling voice, "Where's the child?" He had a feeling that if the child was gone, he and Wen Yuan would be finished. Please remember the domain name of this book, .com. Miao Shu Wu. Chapter 38-41. Hearing his question, Su Mo replied in a hoarse voice, "The doctor is still trying his best." She paused for a moment. The doctor suggested to give up, but Wen Yuan must keep the child alive before she falls into a coma. Yimubai closed his eyes, and there was a pained frown on his face. He pushed the door open and saw Wen Yuan lying quietly on the white hospital bed. Her face was as pale as a piece of paper, without a single trace of blood. She didn't look like a pregnant woman at all. Su Mo's voice was very soft. "She's been in a coma and hasn't woken up." Xiangnan came over and cried very sadly. "Auntie is taking care of her at home." She said a few words casually, but Yimubai could imagine Wen Yuan's situation at that time. He clenched his fists and sat down. His voice was a little low. "You go out first." Su Mo wanted to say something, but she swallowed her words and went out quietly. Yimubai looked at Wen Yuan. Her limbs were slender, and her lower abdomen was slightly bulging. There was an 4 drip on her wrist, and the machine on the other side was beeping. She was so quiet, as if she was asleep, but also as if she would never wake up. He held her hand, and it was cold. His voice was hoarse. "Wen Yuan, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have left you. I shouldn't have treated you like this." He lowered his head, and his face was pressed against the back of her hand. Kong Qiao stood at the door, and there was a hint of depression on his handsome face. "Is there any use in saying sorry now?" Kong Qiao didn't come in, and he just said lightly, "If you loved her, you wouldn't have let her fall into such a desperate situation while she was pregnant with your child. If Auntie hadn't come in time, you might not have been able to see her." Yimubai turned his head and looked at the man he used to mind very much. He had always liked Wen Yuan, and they could be considered childhood sweethearts. Kong Qiao lowered his eyes and his gaze landed on Wen Yuan. He said softly, "If I had known that I would hurt her, I would rather not have met her again. I would rather she foolishly chase after her dreams for the rest of her life, foolishly love someone who doesn't love her." Kong Qiao paused for a moment before he continued, "Wen Yuan was never a naive and innocent person. She was just madly in love with someone. She once told me that the person she loved was worth it. She only planned to be crazy once in her life, and she only loved one person. She said that person's name was Yimubai, and he was the most handsome man in the world. Yimubai was also the most gentle man in the world. He loved animals very much, and he was extremely gentle to children. When she said those words, her eyes were glowing, as though there were many little stars in them. At that time, I wanted to cry because I would never have another chance, because she loved you so much. As Kong Chao said that, he lifted up Yimubai's collar. Right now, you're the most gentle man in the world, the most loving man in the world. You abandoned her and let her face all this pain and danger alone. Are you still a man? If you have other women in your heart, then don't marry her. What's wrong with Wen Yuan? She loves you, but that's not a reason for you to hurt her. If you don't love her, then let her go. Why did you suspect her? All the women in the world would cheat and betray Wen Yuan, but she wouldn't. As he said that, Kong Chao's voice was a little choked. She gave up her dreams, she didn't study abroad, and it was all because of you, you bastard. But in your heart, she's cunning, she seduces men, she's useless, she's mediocre. Do you know why? It's because you said on the show that you like gentle women, and that you like girls to be taken care of at home. Is this how you take care of her now that she's a mother? Chapter 38-42. Kong Chao still couldn't bear it and punched him. Yimubai didn't move away. At this moment, his heart was numb. He had heard so much from Kong Chao. These were all things that Wen Yuan had never told him. At that time, Wen Yuan had collected information about him in such a state of mind. She said that he was gentle, that he was a caring man, and that he was very warm, but he treated her so cruelly. In Yimubai's heart, there was an indescribable feeling, and he forgot the pain. In a daze, he heard Kong Chao say, "You are not qualified to have her, and you are not qualified to have her love." Kong Chao didn't stay in the hospital all the time. As he said, Wen Yuan was Yimubai's wife, and she was pregnant with Yimubai's child. She had to make all the decisions by herself. No matter how distressed he was, he could only protect her silently. He was afraid that when she woke up, she would still be stubborn and still love Yimubai, so he chose to give in. This was Kong Chao's love for Wen Yuan. It had been like this for so many years. After Kong Chao left, Su Mo stood at the door and asked softly, "Director Yi, do you want to call a doctor to help you?" Yimubai leaned against the wall, lowered his eyes, and said very lightly, "No need." Su Mo stood there, wanting to say something but hesitating. Yimubai turned his head and looked at her. "What's wrong?" Su Mo bit her lip. "There is nothing between Wen Yuan and Mr. Kong. They are very normal friends." However, after this incident, she didn't know whether Wen Yuan would leave her boss and become an abnormal friend with Kong Chao. Yimubai wiped his face and didn't say anything. He just said, "Call the doctor." Su Mo nodded and called the doctor. Yimubai knew the doctor, so he gave him some information. If Mrs. Yi doesn't wake up, the child in her belly can't be kept any longer. It's very dangerous, for both the adult and the child. Yimubai looked at him with red eyes, and his voice was very hoarse. "How long will it be if she doesn't wake up?" 3 days. The doctor gave him a definite answer. If she doesn't wake up after 3 days, it's recommended to abort the child. Although it's a pity, it has to be done this way. In fact, it's not suitable for this child to be in this state. Yimubai stared at Wen Yuan's face for a long time before asking in a low voice, "Is it because she doesn't have a strong desire to live now?" The doctor was stunned for a moment before he whispered, "You could say that." Yimubai closed his eyes slightly. After a long time, he whispered, "I understand." The doctor sighed and left. At the door, he suddenly turned around. "By the way, Mrs. Yi said that she wanted to keep the baby and she kept calling Mr. Ye's name." Yi Mubai covered his face. His eyes were red and painful. After a long time, he whispered, "Thank you." The doctor wanted to say something comforting, but he couldn't. He knew what this child meant to the couple. It meant hope. After the doctor left, Yi Mubai slowly walked to Wen Yuan's side and sat down. He stayed with her, taking care of her and talking to her. But she didn't wake up. It was like she didn't want to come to the light in the dark. He knew that she didn't want to wake up because she was hurt by him. She begged him not to leave, but he refused. Yi Mubai closed his eyes. His eyes were hot, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Wen Yuan, as long as you wake up, I'll treat you well. I won't leave you easily again." Perhaps, when he was about to lose her, he suddenly realized what he almost lost. Chapter 38-43. When Wen Yuan woke up in the hospital, it was already 3 days later. Her surroundings were white, and her nose was filled with the smell of disinfectant. She blinked her eyes and felt pain all over her body. The pain in her muscles told her that she might have been lying there for a long time. But despite the pain, she instinctively moved her hand to her abdomen. The child was still there. She closed her eyes, and a tear slid down the corner of her eye, dripping down. She was very afraid. Before she fainted, she was very afraid when she fell into a deep sleep. She felt that she had a very, very long dream. In the dream, she had been staying in a quiet place alone. It was very safe there, and she had been there the whole time. But then, she heard Xiangnan calling for his mother. Xiangnan couldn't find her and was very anxious, so she woke up. She was still alive. She lay quietly, and then one of her hands was held by a warm hand. Then, it was Yi Mubai's extremely hoarse voice. "Wen Yuan, you're awake." Wen Yuan's body froze, and her hand was also struggling slightly. It was very weak, but he could feel it. Yi Mubai's voice was hoarse. "Wen Yuan, I'm back." He stroked her forehead and pushed her hair aside. He wanted to kiss her, but her expression was that of rejection, even though her eyes were closed. She refused to open her eyes to look at him. "I'll call the doctor." His breath fell on her neck, and then he spoke in a low voice. Wen Yuan didn't say anything, and her eyelashes trembled slightly. He knew that she was awake, and he also knew that she was awake. Because she was awake, she didn't want to face him. In the end, he still kissed her lips. It was a little cold, not as warm as before. A trace of pain flashed through Yi Mubai's eyes, and he slowly left. He wanted to kiss her fiercely and shatter her coldness, but he was timid. Yi Mubai, actually felt timid in front of Wen Yuan one day. When the kiss ended, her fingers were holding onto the bed sheets. He saw it and watched silently. Then, he slowly left her body, and his fingers gently touched her hand. He raised his eyes and held back the tears that were about to fall from the corners of his eyes. He quickly went out to call the doctor. What followed was a busy morning with all kinds of tests. Yi Mubai accompanied Wen Yuan the whole time, but he almost didn't have the chance to talk to her, and she didn't want to talk to him either. After a busy morning, the doctor smiled and congratulated Yi Mubai. Both the adults and the child were fine. Finally, he left with the nurses. There were only the two of them in the ward, and it was eerily quiet. When Yuan leaned against the headboard and said very softly, "I want to eat some porridge." Hearing her voice, Yi Mubai's heart tightened. "I've already asked the auntie to make it. Su Mo will bring it over later." As he spoke, His voice was almost choked with emotion. It seemed like he hadn't heard her speak for a long time. It seemed like he missed her. He wanted her to say a few more words, but he was afraid that she would tire herself out, and he was also afraid that she would reject him. In the end, he didn't say anything. Fortunately, Suamo came over with the porridge made by the auntie. Suamo put the porridge down and said softly, "I wanted to bring Xiangnan over, but I was afraid that he would be infected. Don't worry, he's very good at home, and he's very obedient. Auntie takes good care of him, and I've been staying there for the past few days. Auntie can't leave sometimes." Sumo's voice trembled as she spoke. She was a witness. She had witnessed the birth of a child from beginning to end, and she had seen the child almost die. At that time, when she saw the blood, she thought that the child would be lost. Chapter 38-44. When Yuan looked at Suamo and smiled faintly. There was a hint of moisture in her eyes. Without Suamo, the child would be lost. The auntie panicked. She didn't say anything, but she remembered it. Suamo went over and held her hand. "Have some porridge." When Yuan nodded. Then, Suamo was in a dilemma. When Yuan couldn't drink in her current condition, she could only feed her. If she fed her, Director Yi would be unhappy and it would be weird. Although Suamo felt bad, they were husband and wife. It wasn't appropriate for outsiders to say anything. So, she turned around stiffly. "I'm going out for a while." Then, she went out and saw Kong Chiao at the door. She stared at Kong Chiao and closed the door slowly. You heard that she woke up. Kong Chiao leaned against the opposite wall. He had long arms and legs. He only wore a gray sweater and a pair of khaki trousers. Suamo walked over. "She's fine. Do you want to see her?" "Not for the time being." Kong Chiao kicked his feet. "I don't want to make things difficult for her." Although he didn't mean for it to happen, he couldn't get away from it. He felt sorry and guilty. He didn't think it was good for Wen Yuan to continue like this. But he also believed that when Yuan would stand up, she wouldn't be like this forever. Because she was once the dazzling Wen Yuan, the one who dazzled everyone's eyes. Suamo smiled and didn't say anything. Kong Chiao looked at her. "Let's have a cup of coffee. Don't you think I'm small?" She was still smiling. Kong Chiao lowered his eyes and looked at her. "I'm not looking for a girlfriend. Who cares if you're big or small?" Then, he came over and hooked his arm around her neck. Suamo understood that he was treating her as a man. Then, she reached out to feel herself. She wasn't small and she wasn't a tomboy. Why couldn't he see the good in her? Why did he treat her as a man? However, Suamo did not know how to dream. For men like Kong Chiao and Yimu Bai, perhaps Bai Shuali and Wen Yuan had the capital to dream, but Suamo did not. She lived a tiring and difficult life every day. She felt like she was living like a dog that was about to die of exhaustion. Now that she had finally gotten a little better, she did not want to return to her original state just because of a little bit of affection. Not everyone was qualified to be Cinderella. She knew it too well. The ward became quiet again. Yimubai walked over to take the thermos and a beautiful bowl that Wen Yuan liked to use. He poured a bowl of water and sat by the bed. His voice was low and hoarse. "I'll feed you." She looked down and put her fingers on her belly. He knew that she still didn't feel safe and was afraid of the baby. Wen Yuan didn't refuse because she was really weak. Wen Yuan didn't say anything. And of Mo of Yun Wen Yuan, of Mo and of Wen. Yimubai fed her patiently and carefully. Then, he tidied up the food and looked at her. She had been lying in bed for a few days and had lost a lot of weight. Her wrist was so thin that it seemed like it would break at any time. Her face was so pale that it was almost transparent. It was heartbreaking to see her like this. For the past 2 days, Kong Qiao's words had been circling in his mind. He thought about it a lot, but most of it was about how he treated her the other day and how he asked her not to contact Kong Qiao. Please remember the domain name of this book. Jiutian Shenhuang. Chapter 38-45. What he had broken wasn't her connection with Kong Qiao, it was her dream. It was because he didn't love her enough that he treated her so cruelly. She was pregnant, holding the crystal piano in front of him. She had shattered it gently, but she had actually shattered herself. When he had insisted on looking for Qin Chen to save Lin Cece, she had been in so much pain. Had she given up all hope for him? He wanted to ask, but he didn't dare to. For the first time, he didn't want to face it. After Wen Yuan finished eating, he wanted to lie down. She slowly shifted herself to lie down and closed her eyes. She felt his gaze on her. He wanted to talk to her, but she didn't know what to say to him. In their world, there was only the sound of shattering. It was broken, and there was nothing left. She wished that he had never said that he liked her, that he had never treated her well. That way, she wouldn't have been hurt so deeply. She had thought that she had gotten it before, but that day, she realized that she had never gotten it. The child, her, and Xiangnan were nothing in his heart. Her status as his wife seemed to be a joke now. He had left without hesitation. Reality was like a slap to Wen Yuan's face. It hurt so much. She had begged him to say that she wasn't feeling well, but he had felt that she was being stubborn. She smiled absent-mindedly and turned her head away. There were tears in the corner of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. What was the point of crying? There was no point in crying in front of a man who didn't love you. Yimubai looked at her, his voice hoarse. Wen Yuan, can we talk? I don't want to talk, she said softly. He was silent for a while before she said, there's nothing else to talk about. Because he couldn't understand that kind of despair. She didn't want to experience it again after experiencing it once. If she was going to die one day, she hoped that it wouldn't be because of a man who didn't love her. After Wen Yuan said that, she closed her eyes and didn't want to talk anymore. Yimubai was still sitting next to her. He could only watch as she closed the door to her heart, but he couldn't do anything about it. At this moment, any further explanation would be futile. She fell asleep, and he stayed by her side. The ward regained its peace and tranquility. Yimubai sat there, gently caressing her face. She fell asleep and no longer resisted. He looked at her quietly, his eyes filled with heartache. After a long time, he tucked her in and walked to the window to look outside. The sky in New York was foggy. He remembered telling Wen Yuan that he would take her back to B City to wait for her to give birth and for Xiangnan to recover. Now, in her heart, did she still want to be with him? Did she still want to return to B City with him? What was she thinking? He didn't want to think, refused to think, that he had hurt her like this. In her eyes, he could no longer see the radiance of the past. He could no longer see the little star that Concho spoke of. When they first got together, he really saw it. He thought it was infatuation, but he didn't know that it was Wen Yuan using all his life to love her. She loved him. She loved him very much. But now, he was confused. His fingers gently touched the cold glass, and he gently wrote her name. Wen Yuan. Do you still love me? Will you still love me in the future? At this moment, he really wanted to go back to the past, to the time when they first met, to the time when they went on a blind date. He would choose to tell her that he liked her very much, and they would try to date and get married. He would marry her as soon as possible. Chapter 38-46. He would make her pregnant and stay by her side without leaving her. Perhaps, back when he regained his memory, or that dark night, he would choose to be tolerant. He would choose to be friends with Kong Qiao. He would follow her when she met her old friend instead of being impatient. Or perhaps he would choose to stay when she said she wasn't feeling well that morning. There were so many people who could go to Qinchen, but he chose to go alone. In Wen Yuan's heart, his choice was between her and Lin Cixi. He had missed too many times. He stood by the window for as long as she slept. He couldn't remember when he fell asleep. He only slept lightly when he couldn't take it anymore. Now that he was fine, he still couldn't fall asleep. He really wanted to talk to her and really wanted her to cry in his arms, but she didn't do anything. The more she acted like this, the more empty his heart felt. He asked himself if he loved her. In the past, it was vague, but now he thought he knew. Yimubai turned around and his gaze fell on Wen Yuan's face. He stared at her, his eyes filled with reluctance. Just like that, their relationship was indifferent. Because Wen Yuan almost had a miscarriage, she stayed in the hospital for a whole month. Yimubai didn't do anything and stayed by her side for a month. She didn't let him go, but she still didn't talk to him much. She just liked to be in a daze. He wondered if she was thinking about the future, thinking about leaving him. Their relationship was very subtle. They were constantly linked because they had 2 children. If they didn't have children, she would have left him decisively. Yimubai thought, the day before Wen Yuan was discharged, Kong Qiao came over. Yimubai wasn't there. He didn't know if he deliberately avoided her or something. When Kong Qiao walked into the ward, Wen Yuan stood by the window in a daze. She was wearing a hospital gown. She was 5 months pregnant, but it looked empty. Her black hair reached her waist and scattered like seaweed. Kong Qiao remembered that the first time he saw Wen Yuan was because of her hair. Her hair was black and thick, the kind that could be used in advertisements. He looked at her quietly and after a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, "You're discharged tomorrow." Wen Yuan's body froze as if she was a little shocked. Then she slowly turned her head. This was the first time they had met in months. Their eyes met and stared at each other for a long time. Then she smiled faintly. Kong Qiao. Kong Qiao looked at her carefully and finally confirmed that there were stars in her eyes. She was still the same as before. Wen Yuan was still Wen Yuan, and she did not fall down in a sorry state. He smiled back at her, the corners of his mouth lifted but trembled. He said 3 words silently. "I'm sorry." Wen Yuan shook his head. No, Concho doesn't need it. In her and Yimubai's emotional world, Kong Qiao never needed to apologize. It was all her fault. She was too persistent. It was her fault that she almost lost the child. Her tears almost fell. Concho stepped forward and helped her wipe them away. He loved her dearly and no longer restrained himself. He hugged her and carefully held her in his arms to comfort her. "It's okay, Wen Yuan." He loved her as if she was her brother and he suppressed his feelings. Wen Yuan laughed and cried in his arms. "I know, I'm not afraid." She was just a little sad and upset. She didn't have any family by her side, and Kong Qiao was the only warmth she could rely on. She hugged the warmth that belonged to her, while Yimubai stood at the door of the ward. He looked at the smile on her face and the tears on her face. His whole body felt cold. Chapter 38-47. Yimubai just looked at Wen Yuan. He watched her cry and smile in front of others. But she wouldn't do that in front of him. His face became distorted because of extreme disappointment, and his fingers clenched into fists. He probably guessed what she was thinking and what she would think, but he wasn't willing to give up. He wanted to try to warm up her frozen heart again. When Yuan saw him, but she was still holding Kong Qiao. There was even a hint of provocation in her eyes. She was his wife, but she was holding Kong Qiao, the man he wasn't allowed to have a phone call with before. She was pushing him and testing his bottom line. Yi Mubai knew that. It wasn't that he didn't care, but he couldn't afford it. He looked at her quietly, and so did she. She probably felt that it was meaningless, so she let go of Kong Qiao. "Thank you for being with me for so long." He didn't say it, but she knew that he had been in New York and attended a lot of events. Kong Qiao just smiled and said nothing. When he left, he looked at Yi Mubai and paused. In the end, he was in no position to say anything. When Yuan was still his wife, Kong Qiao wasn't a man who would take advantage of others. He hoped that when Yuan would make all the decisions by herself. Even if she was willing to continue the marriage, he would support her, but he believed that she wouldn't let herself live a miserable life. After Kong Qiao left, only when Yuan and Yi Mubai were left in the ward. He slowly closed the door and stood there for a while before saying in a low voice, "I just talked to the doctor. We can go home now. We just have to come for a prenatal checkup once a week." When Yuan sat on the sofa and said softly, "Got it." He went over and squatted beside her, saying in a low voice, "When Yuan, I'll be with you, okay? I'll always be with you." When Yuan's eyes slowly moved to his face, but she didn't say anything. Yi Mubai felt a stab of pain in his heart, but he just gently put his hand on her knee and whispered, "When Yuan, you don't even want to talk to me now." She just looked at him, motionless. Yi Mubai's eyes flashed with pain. "Weren't you having a good chat with Kong Qiao just now?" This time, when Yuan spoke to him, she had a faint smile on her face, a smile that he wished he could treasure. His voice was hoarse. "Can you talk to me?" His face was buried in her lap. "I don't want to give you up." When Yuan finally said, "You don't mind me hanging out with Kong Qiao anymore?" "Yi Mubai, even if I carry him, you won't mind, right?" He looked up. When Yuan continued, "I don't want to be domineering or give in. Yi Mubai, I just want an equal relationship." After saying that, she sighed. "I'm tired. I want to sleep for a while." However, he could only watch helplessly as she left. The next day, when Yuan was taken home by Yi Mubai, it wasn't the previous apartment, but a bigger and more luxurious place. He didn't want her to live there anymore. They had quarreled there, and she had almost lost her child there. It was not an auspicious place. The new apartment was also in a prime location. It was bigger than before, and the decoration was a little gentler than before. It was just like what Wen Yuan liked, and there was an expensive piano in the direction of the floor-to-ceiling window. When Yuan walked in slowly, her eyes fell on the piano, and she was a little stunned. Chapter 38-48. Yi Mubai asked the driver to put down the things and leave. He hugged her gently from behind. "Do you like it? You can play the piano here in the future." When Yuan still looked at the piano quietly. After a long time, she was in a daze. "It's not convenient for me now." His palm slid down and landed on her bulging belly. His warm breath fell on her neck. It was a little numb. "Then play it after you give birth to the child. Let Xiangnan learn from you. We'll talk about it later," she said in a low voice and then asked him politely, "Where's my bedroom?" "Your bedroom." He looked at her and repeated. When Yuan smiled faintly and nodded, "Yes, my bedroom." Yi Mubai turned her around and looked at her carefully. "We won't sleep separately. She seemed to be tired. I'm pregnant and need to rest. Besides, we can't sleep together. The doctor said that. She used the doctor's words as a shield. Yimubai's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was thinking, but he still had a glimmer of hope. He didn't say anything and brought her to a suite facing the south. This suite was about 80 square meters, and it came with a bathroom, changing room, and living room. It was very feminine, and her belongings had already been moved over. Wen Yuan was a meticulous woman. She naturally found that there were also his belongings. Did he still want to sleep in the same room with her? She didn't know what he was thinking. Did a husband and wife who had broken up like this still need to sleep in the same bed? At this time, she really wanted to go back to the hospital. At least there, she wouldn't have to worry about him climbing into her bed in the middle of the night. Wen Yuan admitted that she had lost hope in this relationship, but she had Xiangnan. The child in her belly needed a status. She wouldn't choose to leave Yimubai at this time. If a woman lost her mind without love, it would be very sad. In the end, she didn't object anymore. If he wanted to sleep together, they would sleep together. Anyway, she wasn't the one who was sad. Wen Yuan fell asleep. Just like in the hospital, she treated him as invisible. She didn't talk to him, didn't communicate with him, and didn't even want to smile at him. Yimubai stood there, silently watching her as she slept. She slept peacefully. She wanted to protect the child. He could feel that she was deliberately controlling her emotions. Everything she was doing now was for the child and Xiangnan. He, Yimubai, was probably nothing in her life. Just thinking about it made him feel a little uncomfortable. But no matter how painful it was, he had to endure it. Day by day, she endured and took care of him. She was still the same. She was indifferent. It was not that she did not say a word, but she would say a few words when necessary. Especially in front of Xiangnan, she would act very normal. Occasionally, she would even smile, as if their relationship was normal. Yimubai sat at the dining table and watched her smile gently at Xiangnan. At this moment, he was actually jealous of his own son. He had been with her for the past few days and hadn't gone anywhere. He had even temporarily moved his office to the apartment across the street, afraid that something would happen to her and he wouldn't be around. He waited on her as if he was walking on thin ice, but he still couldn't walk into her heart. Kong Chao said that when Wen Yuan talked about him, there were little stars in her eyes. But when he looked at her now, there was only a pool of stagnant water, without any ripples. He wondered if she was only like this when she was with him. Toward others, like Kong Chao, she could still ignite her passion. Chapter 38-49. Yimubai's gaze fell on Wen Yuan's face for a long time. Of course, she could feel his burning gaze, but she pretended not to notice. After dinner, she coaxed Xiangnan to sleep like before, then went back to her room to take a shower, apply her skincare products, and watch prenatal education for a while before going to bed. Her life was very regular. In this 600 square meter apartment, there were 4 or 5 servants serving her, and she had Yimubai by her side. She lived a good life, but he didn't know if she felt good in her heart. Perhaps she had already regarded this place as a place to live, and it had nothing to do with feelings. Yimubai sat on the sofa in front of the French window in the bedroom, holding a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't light it. It was impossible for him to smoke in the bedroom. Although he smoked a little heavily recently, he restrained himself in front of her. It had been another month since she was discharged from the hospital. Her body had become rounder under proper care, and her face had gained some weight. He hugged her to sleep every night. He had needs, but he never dared to touch her, afraid that he wouldn't be able to control himself. The damn doctor said that they couldn't have sex before they had a child. He thought that even if they could, she wouldn't want it anymore. She might even hate it. Yimubai looked at the night outside, then looked at the bathroom door, guessing when she would come out. When Yuan came out, he was stunned for a moment when he saw him, then went over to apply his skincare products. He stared at her for a long time, but he still couldn't help walking over to her. When Yuan saw him in the mirror, but he paused for a moment before continuing to apply his skincare products, as if he didn't exist. Of course, Yimubai couldn't accept her ignoring him, and he was already suppressing his anger tonight. He put his hands on the back of her chair, leaned his face close to her neck, and said in a low voice, "When Yuan, you take such good care of yourself. Is it for me?" She was so disgusted with him, and he couldn't help but think that she was looking for a new home. When Yuan finished wiping the night cream on his hands, then said softly, "Are you looking for trouble tonight? If you must know, I'm doing it for myself. Are you satisfied?" He couldn't stand her talking to him like that. He wanted to pull her up, but when he saw her stomach, he held himself back. He closed his eyes. "I wouldn't dare to cause trouble for you." After saying that, he left with a cigarette and lighter. She knew that he had gone outside to smoke. He had been smoking heavily recently. But what did it have to do with her? In the study, Yimubai was smoking fiercely. The whole study was filled with smoke. His eyes were a little red. He really did not understand Wen Yuan at all. When she loved someone, her eyes were like little stars, but when she hated someone, she could not wait to kill that person. She hated him so much that she did not give him any chance at all. He could guess what she was thinking. She was just waiting for the baby to be born so she could leave him. He knew it, but he was powerless to stop it. She hadn't touched the piano he had bought. She hadn't even looked at it. Other than the necessities, she hadn't opened any of the gifts he had given her. He had even seen her take off the ring he had given her, and he hadn't seen her wear the bracelet either. The line was clearly drawn. He smoked, and then he couldn't help but drink a few glasses of red wine. He did not dare to get drunk, afraid that he would hurt her. When he returned to the bedroom, Wen Yuan was already asleep. He thought, "Yes, she is so heartless now. Why would she wait for me?" Chapter 38:50. He walked into the bedroom and didn't turn on the lights. He stood at the head of the bed in the dark and watched her. She was sleeping peacefully. Under the blanket, her slender limbs propped up her round belly. She looked rather cute, but in Yimubai's eyes, she was utterly detestable. He leaned forward and gently caressed her face. He was very meticulous. She was well taken care of, and she also took good care of herself. He was annoyed that he had rudely woken her up while he was still drunk. When Yuan opened her eyes and saw the tall figure at the head of the bed, he squatted down beside her. Her face was buried in the pillow, and she could still smell the faint smell of alcohol and tobacco. He had drunk. She instinctively wanted to move away, but he wouldn't let her. He grabbed onto her and dragged her over. His voice was deep and husky. "Wen Yuan, do you not want to talk to me anymore?" She stared at him in the dark, then turned her head away and closed her eyes. "It's getting late. Are you going to throw a tantrum now?" "Yimubai, I'm pregnant." "I know you're pregnant. Otherwise, do you think I would have been able to hold it in for so long?" His voice was hoarse and full of danger. As he spoke, he leaned over and kissed her lips under her gaze. This was the first time he had kissed her in 2 months. Her belly was quite big, and it was hindering him. He carefully avoided it. The corner of his lips touched hers. The moment their lips touched, an indescribable feeling surged in his heart. He said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't hurt you. I would choose to treat you well. She didn't make a sound, nor did she give him a response. He kissed her patiently. When he kissed her, he felt as though time had staggered. He really wanted to go back to the past, to the time when she loved him. He wanted to see the little stars in her eyes. He hoped that in her heart, he was still that caring and warm man. Can't go back. He murmured, kissing the corner of her lips gently. His voice was extremely hoarse. When Yuan still closed her eyes and let him kiss her. She didn't reject, resist, or respond. He was finally drunk. Taking advantage of the alcohol, he bit down hard on her lips. She endured the pain, and her fingers clenched the sheets beneath her. He acted fiercely and kissed her fiercely. When he looked up, his voice was filled with pain. When Yuan, you don't even know how to cry out in pain, do you? She still didn't say anything. Yimubai closed his eyes and said in a hoarse voice, will you love me again? When Yuan did not answer him. If she said that she would be lying. She didn't want to do that anymore. She was no longer the girl who smiled at him and played all kinds of tricks. She was tired. She had not only lost love, but also her 2 children and her life. She was tired and did not want to love. If love, she chooses to love herself. Yimubai rolled to the side and hugged her from the side. His face was buried in her neck. He had an indescribable pain. Later, perhaps because he was unwilling, perhaps because he wanted to prove something, he pulled her hand and forced himself on her. When Yuan was stunned. As he struggled, he said in a broken voice, Yimubai, let go of me. He did not let go of her. He hugged her tightly in his arms, avoiding her stomach. His voice was especially hoarse. When Yuan, I'm going crazy. When he said this, his voice was trembling. I've never been like this. I've never regretted it so much. Chapter 38:51. His face was buried deep in her neck like a child who lacked love. However, what he forced her to do wasn't like what a child would do. It was urgent and shameful, so when Yuan didn't struggle. It was like a huge wave rolling the sand. The more intense it was, the slower it would calm down. His breath was scorching hot as it sprayed into her neck. His voice was also very urgent. When Yuan, love me, please. He reached out to hug her, as if he wanted to crush her in his arms, when Yuan didn't make a sound. If he wanted to kiss her, she could give him the pleasure of sharing their bodies. However, when he said that he wanted her to love him again, she couldn't give it. She didn't want to give it. Love wasn't something that could be given as one wished. It wasn't something that could be given as one wished. She had no strength left to face him. Yimubai was already an arrow at the end of its flight, but he still wasn't willing to give up and continued to mess around. However, he couldn't go back after all. He took advantage of the alcohol and messed around for half the night, but it was just a bluff. Everything calmed down. When Yuan leaned into his arms, her face rubbing against his black shirt. The texture was very good, and his scent was very pleasant. In the past, if he was willing to hug her for so long, she would be very happy. However, she didn't feel anything at all now. She only felt that it was a burden. He couldn't control his emotions, and she was like a pool of stagnant water. It was hard to maintain such a relationship, just like in the past. The difference was that they didn't even have the tacit understanding of sharing their bodies. After a long time, Yimubai's voice was very soft. Let me help you wash up. He seemed to have returned to normal. He quietly took a hot towel to wipe her hands and covered her with the blanket. His dark eyes stared at her silently for a long time before he said in a low voice, I'm going to take a shower. When Yuan closed her eyes. There was a thin layer of red on her face, and she looked very beautiful when buried in her hair. He was a little moved when he saw her, and he especially wanted to kiss her for a while longer. However, her cold look made him give up. He got up and went to the changing room to get a bathrobe to take a shower. He was gone for about half an hour before he came back. Wen Yuan knew that it wasn't enough just now, so he probably took care of it himself. She buried her face in the pillow and turned sideways, trying hard not to interact with him. Yimubai lay flat on the bed, silently looking at the ceiling, not saying anything. That was the state of their marriage. Even though Xiangnan was a child, he was a smart child. Even though his parents did not quarrel, he could still sense something. He asked Wen Yuan once if he would be separating from his father. Wen Yuan looked at him for a long time before asking softly, "Are you willing to be with mommy?" Xiangnan stared at her for a few seconds before he reached out and hugged her waist. He pressed his hand against her bulging belly and said softly, "And the baby?" Wen Yuan smiled and patted his head. Their marriage continued indifferently. Wen Yuan didn't care about him, but she had someone she cared about. She cared about Xiangnan and the baby in her belly. She slowly found her own interests. She began to learn flower arranging and tea making. It was all done at home by the trainer she asked Su Mo to find. She became happier day by day. Yimubai could see it, but she was still cold to him. They often slept together for a night and didn't talk much. Yimubai sometimes suspected that she had a heart of stone, but more often than not, he knew that it was his doing. Chapter 38-52. Baishuali brought Bai Anan to New York. She had brought a lot of things from B City and stayed there for a few days to accompany Wen Yuan. Everyone in the Yi family knew about Wen Yuan and Yimubai. They had all come to the hospital, but Wen Yuan didn't talk much at that time and no one dared to force her to talk. After being slapped twice by Yi Jinggang, Yimubai was finally unyielding. Is your wife and child more important or the woman you like more important? Your wife said she wasn't feeling well and you still wanted to leave. Why did you marry her if you don't like her? Why didn't you do a test tube test? Oh, you want to have fun, right? Anyway, the woman you like is getting married and it doesn't matter who you marry. Is that what you think? Yimubai didn't say anything, but Yi Jinggang was certain and scolded him. In the end, it was Su Fu who pulled him away. They all felt sorry for Wen Yuan and were even more worried about the child in Xiangnan and Wen Yuan's womb. They were afraid that Wen Yuan would be disappointed with Yimubai and give up on the child. But not only did Wen Yuan wake up, the child was also saved. But everyone could see that the expression in her eyes was different. She no longer looked at Yimubai with love but calmness. She had returned to her normal self. Baishuali was really afraid that they would get a divorce. To her, it was a dilemma. Cici was her friend and Wen Yuan was also her friend and family. If Wen Yuan and Xiao Bai got a divorce, it would be hard for Cici to continue living. She was the victim of a car accident. Yimubai had messed up the family, but it had nothing to do with Cici. She wanted to speak up for Cici and Wen Yuan could tell. He poured her a cup of flower tea and said softly, "What happened between us has nothing to do with others. It's our own fault." Baishuali felt sad again. She bit her lip and looked at him. Wen Yuan smiled. "It's not her fault." Wen Yuan. Baishuali reached out and pulled his hand. "I'm a little sad to see you like this." "Fool, what are you feeling sad about?" Wen Yuan smiled faintly and reached out to pinch Baishuali's face. "You're still crying. You're already so big. No wonder Yi Mulin always said that you're still like a child. He said that even though he has 2 children, Anan is more sensible than you. That's what he said." Bai Shuali stuttered, then bit her lip and didn't say anything else. It was rare for her to come, so when Yuan's mood was a little better. I'm not convinced. Aren't you just being willful because he likes you? Bai Shuali could not help but complain, when did I do that? You don't know how difficult it is to deal with old men. He said it was for me, but it was all for his own bad taste. When Yuan, you don't understand Yi Mulin. He's just, very immoral. When Yuan smiled. Then, they started chatting. Bai Shuali felt that Wen Yuan was quite normal. How did he end up like this with Lao Bai? Before leaving New York, she and Yi Mubai made an appointment at a small bar outside to have a chat. Yi Mubai had been smoking the whole time. When Yuan looked at him frowning slightly and pursed his lips. Lao Bai, you weren't like this in the past. She had pursued Lao Bai before. He used to be pure and lived like a monk. Later on, he only fell in love with Lin Cece. It was not bad, but Lin Cece liked Guze. She was hurt all over and her heart was still with Guze. There was nothing she could do about it. End of chapter. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.